Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we're going to slow everything down, not to race toward revelations or dramatic claims, but to settle into something quieter and far more specific. We're going to talk about what the Anunnaki ate, how they structured their days, and what daily existence actually looked like for them according to the oldest texts that mention their presence at all. Not the version shaped by modern speculation, not the images filled with glowing technology or distant planets, but the version that emerges when the tablets are read patiently, line by line, without trying to force them to say more than they do. If you're listening late at night, perhaps with the lights dimmed or the room quiet except for a fan or distant traffic, you're in exactly the right place. These stories were never meant to be rushed. They come from a world where time moved differently, where memory mattered more than precision, and where daily life was understood as something woven into cosmic order rather than separated from it. If you find this kind of exploration soothing, if it helps your mind slow down rather than speed up, you can like the video or subscribe, but only if it genuinely fits into your night. This is not a place for urgency. It's a place for careful attention. Now, let's ease into the subject itself. When people today ask what the Anunnaki ate and how they lived, the question usually carries a modern assumption. It imagines beings who are either entirely symbolic, living only in myth, or entirely alien, requiring advanced sustenance and operating beyond ordinary physical limits. But the Sumerian text suggests something far more restrained, and in many ways far more interesting. They describe powerful beings, certainly, but beings who functioned within a structured world. A world with resources, rhythms, responsibilities and limits. In the earliest layers of Sumerian literature, the Anunnaki do not appear as wandering visitors or omnipotent overseers. They appear as members of a divine order that already existed, one that required maintenance and balance. They are not depicted as beings who transcend material concerns entirely. On the contrary, the texts repeatedly imply that gods, including the Anunnaki, depended on systems of provision. They required nourishment, rest, ritual purity, and regulated interaction with the world they governed. This is where the modern image begins to fall apart. If the Anunnaki needed no food, there would be no reason for temples to function as centres of daily offerings. If they did not live within time, there would be no emphasis on calendars, feast days, or cycles of ritual observance. If they were detached from physical existence, the detailed attention given to preparation, cleanliness, and correct procedure would make little sense. Yet the texts are filled with these details, not as symbolic afterthoughts, but as practical necessities. The Sumerians did not imagine their gods as abstract concepts floating beyond reality. They imagined them as powerful occupants of it. This is especially clear when we look at how offerings are described. Food is not presented as a metaphor. It is described by type, quantity, preparation, and timing. Bread is baked. Beer is brewed. Animals are slaughtered, divided, cooked, and presented in prescribed ways. The gods receive these offerings regularly, not as occasional gestures, but as part of an ongoing relationship between divine and human realms. This implies something crucial. The Anunnaki, like other gods in the Sumerian pantheon, participated in a cycle of consumption. Not necessarily because they would starve without it in the way humans would, but because their continued presence and authority within the world depended on it. The gods were sustained by order, and food was one of the primary expressions of that order. To understand what they ate, we first have to understand where they lived. The texts do not place the Anunnaki in distant heavens removed from the world. Their primary association is with the earth and the underworld, with spaces beneath the surface, with places of judgment, fate, and continuity. This positioning matters. It suggests an existence that is grounded rather than celestial, administrative rather than exploratory. Their environment was structured, controlled, and stable. It required upkeep, and that upkeep involved human participation. Temples were not simply places of worship. They were functioning households. They stored grain. They brewed beer, they kept livestock, they employed bakers, brewers, herders, butchers, and cooks. These were not symbolic roles. They were necessary because the gods were believed to receive and consume what was prepared. When tablets list temple inventories, they do not read like poetry. They read like accounting. Barley measured in precise amounts. Jars of beer counted and categorized. Sheep and cattle listed by age and condition. This administrative tone tells us something important about how the gods were understood. Their needs were predictable. Their consumption followed patterns. Their daily existence fit into schedules that humans could track and maintain. This brings us to an uncomfortable realization for modern audiences. The Anunnaki did not live above routine. They lived within it. They existed in a world where mornings mattered, where offerings were delivered at specific times, where purity had to be maintained, and where neglect had consequences. A missed offering was not just a symbolic lapse, it was a disruption of balance. It could result in drought, illness, or social instability. Not because the gods were petty, but because the system itself depended on continuity. Food, in this context, was not indulgence, it was maintenance. What they consumed reflects this. The staples offered to the gods mirror the staples of Sumerian life. Bread made from barley or emmer wheat. Beer thick enough to be eaten rather than drunk, consumed through straws to avoid sediment. Meat from domesticated animals, prepared according to ritual rules. Dairy products, oils, fruits when available. These were not exotic substances. They were the products of agricultural labour, of irrigation systems, of seasonal planning. The Anunnaki, as described in the texts, did not require substances unknown to humanity. They required what humanity already produced, but produced in an ordered, respectful and consistent way. This tells us something about how they lived. They did not wander. They resided. They had designated spaces. They withdrew from the human world not because they were absent, but because boundaries were necessary. Temples served as controlled points of contact. Inside them, daily life continued in a regulated manner. Outside them, the human world unfolded, but always with an awareness that divine attention could be drawn or withdrawn depending on behaviour. The Anunnaki were not omnipresent. They were localized. Their living conditions, as implied by the texts, were clean, structured, and insulated from chaos. Ritual cleanliness was not an abstract moral concept. It was a physical requirement. Water was used for washing. Incense purified the air. Clothing was maintained according to strict rules. Disorder was dangerous, not metaphorically but operationally. Disorder invited imbalance. This makes their lifestyle feel less alien and more administrative. They lived as overseers, not conquerors, as managers of fate, not explorers of worlds. Their days were filled with judgment, observation, and the maintenance of cosmic function. Their sustenance reflected that role. Heavy foods associated with labour were offered to humans. Balanced, prepared foods were offered to gods, and this is where the narrative begins to shift. Because once we understand what they ate and how they lived, we can no longer imagine them as beings who arrived suddenly, consumed resources violently, and departed without consequence. The texts describe continuity, not intrusion. They describe integration, not domination. They describe a long coexistence built on shared systems rather than technological superiority. This does not mean the Anunnaki were ordinary. Far from it. But it does mean they were embedded in the same world they governed, subject to its rhythms, dependent on its stability, sustained by its productivity. As we move forward, the focus will narrow further, from general structures to specific foods, from shared spaces to daily routines, from public ritual to private withdrawal, each layer revealing something quieter and more restrained than modern imagination expects. For now, let the idea settle. The Anunnaki did not live beyond life. They lived within it. Before diets and daily routines had meaning, Existence itself functioned without the kind of structure that later societies would take for granted. There was no concept of breakfast or rest days, no distinction between labour hours and moments of withdrawal, no carefully separated cycles of nourishment and exhaustion. In the earliest layers of Sumerian thought, long before the Anunnaki are described as a defined group with specific responsibilities, the world is portrayed as operating in a state that was ordered but not yet optimized. Things existed, but they did not yet follow the repetitive patterns that make daily life predictable. The texts describe a time when creation had already occurred, but habit had not yet set in. Heaven and earth had been separated. Waters had been divided. Light moved across the sky, and the ground beneath it was solid. But the systems that would later regulate life were still incomplete. There was activity without schedule, sustenance without refinement, and presence without the routines that later defined both human and divine existence. This matters because routine is not a given. It is something that emerges when survival stabilizes and when repetition becomes possible. Before that point, nourishment is opportunistic. Rest is irregular. Living beings respond to conditions rather than shaping them. The earliest Sumerian cosmology reflects this transitional phase clearly. The gods existed, but they did not yet operate within the carefully maintained cycles that later texts assume. In this early state, consumption was not ritualized. There is no emphasis on prepared meals, measured offerings, or designated times for feeding the gods. Instead, the focus is on the raw conditions of existence. Water dominates the narrative. Clay appears as a substance of formation. Wind, light, and movement are present, but not yet disciplined. The world works, but it does not yet repeat itself smoothly. The Anunnaki do not appear at this stage as beings with preferences or habits. They are not described as sitting, eating, or resting. They are part of a larger divine population that has come into being, but whose roles are still fluid. Identity exists, but specialization does not. The gods are present, but they are not yet embedded in systems that require daily maintenance. This early phase is important because it establishes a contrast. Later texts assume order so completely that it feels eternal. Meals are prepared every day. Offerings follow calendars. Labour is assigned. Rest is regulated. But all of that comes later. Before it does, there is a period where existence itself is still adjusting to its own structure. In that early world, nourishment is implied rather than described. The gods draw sustenance from the environment in ways that are not yet formalized. The waters provide, the earth produces but without cultivation. There is no mention of bread or beer because agriculture has not yet taken shape. There is no mention of herds because domestication has not yet occurred. Food exists, but it is not processed. It is part of the environment rather than something prepared. This suggests that the earliest divine existence was closer to natural balance than to civilized routine. The gods did not yet require human mediation to sustain them. There were no temple kitchens, no storehouses, no priestly roles dedicated to preparation. That entire apparatus only becomes necessary once the world shifts into a new phase, one where complexity demands management. The transition away from this early state begins when labour enters the narrative. The texts describe lesser gods being burdened with physical work. They dig canals. They pile earth. They shape the land so that it can support organised life. This is the first hint that existence has become demanding. Maintenance has become necessary. And with maintenance comes exhaustion. This is the moment when daily routines begin to form, not because of preference, but because of necessity. Work requires energy. Energy requires nourishment. Nourishment requires reliable sources. Reliable sources require planning. Planning requires repetition. What begins as survival slowly becomes schedule. The Anunnaki emerge more clearly in the texts after the shift has begun. They are not the ones digging canals or shaping the land. They occupy higher positions in the divine order. But they exist within a system that now includes labour, provision, and rest. Their lives are no longer free of structure. They participate in governance rather than creation, in judgment rather than formation. Their existence becomes defined by roles rather than raw presence. This is when consumption starts to matter, not yet in the form of elaborate rituals, but in the recognition that sustenance is no longer automatic. The world now produces according to rules. Water must be guided, crops must be planted, animals must be tended. Even gods who do not perform this labour depend on its results. Their continued authority depends on the stability of the system that produces food, materials and order. At this stage, the texts still do not describe diets in the way later compositions do. There are no menus, no lists of offerings, no emphasis on preparation techniques. But there is a growing awareness that nourishment must be managed. The divine realm is no longer self-sustaining. It relies on a functioning world. This reliance changes how the gods live. They become more settled. They establish domains. They inhabit specific locations rather than existing everywhere at once. This localization creates the need for regular interaction with those places. A god who resides somewhere must be present there. Presence requires stability. Stability requires routine. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and fate, are especially affected by this shift. Their role requires continuity. Judgments must be rendered consistently. Fate must be maintained without interruption. This kind of function cannot exist in a world without structure. It requires predictable conditions. Predictable conditions require daily rhythms. As these rhythms form, the distinction between divine and human existence begins to narrow in unexpected ways, not in power, but in process. Both realms now operate within time. Both require maintenance. Both depend on regular cycles of activity and rest. The difference lies in responsibility, not in exemption. This is a critical point often missed by later interpretations. The Anunnaki are powerful, but they are not outside the system. They do not float above it, immune to its demands. They are embedded within it, even if they sit at its upper levels. Their existence is structured, not chaotic, governed, not free. Before this shift, daily routines had no meaning because nothing depended on them. After it, routines become essential because everything does. The emergence of humanity accelerates this process. Humans are created specifically to take on labour. This is not framed as a moral event but as an administrative solution. The gods require relief. The system requires workers. Humanity fills that role. With humans come new layers of routine. Fields are planted annually. Harvests follow seasons. Offerings are prepared daily. Temples become centres of constant activity. The divine world now has a regular interface with the human one, and that interface is structured by time. For the Anunnaki, this means their existence becomes increasingly formalized. They are no longer simply present. They are scheduled. Their attention is directed. Their sustenance is provided at specific times in specific ways. This does not diminish them. It defines them. What they eat and how they live cannot be understood without recognizing this progression. It begins in a world without habit. It moves through a phase of emerging labour. It settles into a system where routine is not optional, but foundational. By the time the Anunnaki appear as recognizable figures in the texts, diets and daily routines have already become meaningful. They exist because the world now depends on them. The gods depend on them. Humanity depends on them. But this meaning was not always there. It emerged slowly, shaped by necessity rather than design, and traces of that earlier, less structured existence remain embedded in the texts, quietly reminding us that even divine life was once unregulated, fluid, and still finding its rhythm. As the world continues to organize itself, attention shifts from existence itself to the details of living within it, from the fact of nourishment to its form, from presence to habit, from survival to maintenance, and that shift changes everything that follows. They were not gods reclining endlessly at banquets, surrounded by excess and indulgence, untouched by limitation or need. The Sumerian texts do not describe the Anunnaki as beings who existed in a state of perpetual abundance, feasting without consequence or effort. Instead, what emerges from the tablets is something far more restrained and in many ways more revealing. The Anunnaki appear as beings with needs, not needs identical to those of humans, but needs nonetheless, needs that shaped how they lived, where they resided, and how their relationship with the world around them was maintained. This distinction is subtle, but it is essential. Later mythologies, especially those shaped by royal courts and imperial cultures, often imagine gods as mirrors of elite human life. They dined lavishly because kings dined lavishly. They rested endlessly because rulers were served. But the Sumerian worldview formed earlier, closer to the origins of urban life, when surplus was fragile and stability was hard-won. In that context, even divine existence was imagined as dependent on order rather than excess. The Anunnaki were powerful, but they were not removed from the mechanics of existence. Their authority did not erase the need for sustenance, it reorganized it. When offerings are described in Sumerian texts, they are not framed as symbolic gestures meant to flatter divine vanity. They are framed as provisions, measured, counted, recorded and repeated. Grain is allocated. Beer is brewed in quantities that match daily requirements. Animals are selected according to condition and age. These details appear again and again, not because scribes were obsessed with ritual minutiae, but because the system depended on accuracy. The gods required consistency. This consistency points toward need. If the gods were entirely self-sustaining, offerings would be optional. They would function purely as expressions of devotion. But the texts treat them as obligations. Failing to provide them leads to consequences. Crops fail. Rivers misbehave. Illness spreads. These outcomes are not described as punishments in a moral sense, but as breakdowns in balance. The system stops working when provision stops. The Anunnaki, as part of this system, depended on its functioning. Their needs were not framed as hunger in the human sense. Nowhere do the texts describe gods starving. But hunger is not the only form of need. There is the need for maintenance, for renewal, for stabilization. The gods required what sustained their presence in the world. Food was part of that, not because it filled a stomach, but because it anchored them to order. This anchoring is visible in how divine meals are imagined. The gods do not hunt. They do not forage. They do not cook. These activities belong to the human realm. Instead, the gods receive prepared food. This distinction matters. Preparation is labor. It requires time, skill, and coordination. By receiving prepared offerings, the gods are positioned as dependents of a functioning society. This is not weakness. It is structure. The Anunnaki are situated within a hierarchy where roles are distributed. Humans labor. Priests organize, temples store, the gods receive. Each role supports the others. The gods provide protection and order. Humans provide sustenance and maintenance. This exchange is continuous. It does not pause. In this sense, the Anunnaki are not gods at banquets. They are administrators at the center of a system that must be fed to continue operating. Their daily existence reflects this. They are not described as indulging in endless pleasure. They are described as presiding, judging, observing. Their work is not physical, but it is constant. Fate must be assigned. Boundaries must be maintained. Decisions must be enforced. This kind of role requires stability. Stability requires replenishment. Food, drink, and ritual purity serve that purpose. Beer, in particular, appears repeatedly in offerings. Not as a luxury, but as a staple. Sumerian beer was thick, nourishing, and caloric. It was closer to a fermented grain porridge than a modern beverage. Offering beer to the gods was not about intoxication. It was about providing sustenance in a form that symbolized civilization itself. Beer required agriculture, storage, brewing, and coordination. It represented the success of the human world. By receiving beer, the gods were receiving proof that the system was working. Bread functioned similarly. It was baked daily. It could not be stored indefinitely. Its presence in offerings indicates regularity. The gods were not fed occasionally. They were fed continually. This implies expectation. Expectation implies need. The Anunnaki's needs extended beyond food. Cleanliness is emphasized repeatedly in texts associated with divine presence. Ritual washing is not symbolic alone. It reflects an understanding that impurity disrupts function. The gods require environments that are controlled and maintained. Dust, decay, and disorder threaten stability. The gods withdraw when these conditions worsen. Withdrawal, in this context, is not abandonment. It is disengagement caused by unmet requirements. This further reinforces the idea that the gods were not omnipresent. They resided where conditions allowed them to remain. Temples that fell into neglect lost divine favour, not because the gods were offended, but because the infrastructure that sustained them had failed. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and fate, required especially strict conditions. Their role demanded clarity. Decisions could not be clouded by disorder. Their presence depended on environments where boundaries were respected, offerings were consistent, and procedures were followed. This is a far cry from the image of gods lounging in abundance. Instead, what we see is a model of divine existence that mirrors early urban administration. Authority flows downward. Provision flows upward. Both are necessary. Neither functions alone. The gods did not eat because they were indulgent. They ate because they participated in a system that required exchange. This system also imposed limits. The Anunnaki are not described as endlessly youthful or immune to change. While they are long-lived, they are not static. Renewal appears as a recurring theme. Festivals mark transitions. Rituals restore balance. These acts suggest that divine power, while immense, is not infinite. It must be maintained. Maintenance is the key word here. The Anunnaki lived in a world that could decay. Floods could overwhelm. Droughts could starve. Cities could collapse. When that happened, the gods did not simply fix everything instantly. They reacted. They debated. They adjusted. Their responses reveal that they operated within constraints. Needs create constraints. This does not reduce the Anunnaki to human status. It situates them within a coherent worldview. A worldview where power is relational rather than absolute. Where authority depends on function, where even gods must be sustained by order. This understanding changes how we interpret later myths. When gods complain of human noise, it is not irritation born of boredom. It is disruption of rhythm. When gods send disasters, it is not cruelty. It is system reset. When gods withdraw, it is not disappearance. It is loss of conditions required for presence. The Anunnaki's needs make sense in this framework. They needed quiet, not for comfort, but for stability. They needed offerings, not for pleasure, but for continuity. They needed structured days, not for routine, but for function. Their lives were not luxurious. They were regulated. They inhabited spaces designed for containment. They interacted through prescribed channels. They consumed what was prepared for them. Their existence was supported, not spontaneous. This makes their world feel closer to ours than later myths suggest, not because they were weak, but because they were integrated. As the narrative continues, attention will shift from the fact of need to the specifics of how those needs were met, from general sustenance to particular foods, from abstract maintenance to daily practice, from roles to routines. The Anunnaki were not gods at banquets. They were beings whose power depended on a world that had to be fed, cleaned, and kept in balance. And that dependency shaped everything that followed. The world they entered was already structured. It was not raw, unfinished, or waiting to be shaped from nothing. By the time the Anunnaki appear as a recognizable group within the Sumerian texts, Existence had already been divided, organised, and stabilised through earlier acts of creation. Heaven had been separated from earth. Waters had been assigned their places. Light moved in predictable patterns across the sky. The ground beneath human feet was no longer an undifferentiated mass, but a landscape with rivers, plains, marshes, and boundaries that could be named and remembered. This is an essential point, because it removes the Anunnaki from the role of primary creators. They did not arrive to bring order to chaos. They entered a system that was already functioning, though not yet perfected. The structures that sustained life were in place, but they required oversight. The world did not need to be made, it needed to be maintained. The Sumerian texts are very clear about this distinction, even if they never stated outright. Creation stories describe the separation of heaven and earth, the establishment of wind and atmosphere, and the emergence of land from water long before the Anunnaki are assigned any role at all. By the time they are mentioned, the fundamental architecture of reality has already been laid down. What remains is administration. This administrative quality defines the world they entered. Rivers already flowed, but they did not regulate themselves. Floods could nourish fields or destroy them. Marshes could support life or spread disease. Rain could arrive at the right moment or fail entirely. These were not random events. They were understood as outcomes of balance or imbalance. A structured world still required management. Cities already existed, at least in mythic memory. Settlements clustered near water. Temples rose on elevated platforms. Fields were cleared and irrigated. Writing was beginning to record transactions and offerings. None of this belonged to a primordial age of chaos. It belonged to a transitional world where order existed but was fragile. This fragility explains why divine presence was imagined as necessary. The Anunnaki did not shape the world from raw material. They entered it as overseers within an existing hierarchy. Their authority derived from lineage and role, not from creative acts. They were descendants of earlier powers, born into a cosmos that already had rules. Their task was not invention, but enforcement. This enforcement extended into every aspect of existence. Time was already segmented. Days followed nights. Months followed lunar cycles. Seasons returned with enough regularity to be tracked. These patterns were not accidental. They were the result of earlier divine action. The Anunnaki inherited them. Their responsibility was to ensure they continued. Land was already claimed. Each city belonged to a patron deity. Boundaries between territories were marked and defended. The Anunnaki did not assign these domains, they operated within them. Their judgments respected these divisions rather than erasing them. Human society too was already structured. People laboured, they farmed, built, traded, and recorded. Hierarchies existed among humans just as they did among gods. Kings ruled by divine sanction. Priests managed rituals. Workers performed the physical labour that sustained both realms. The Anunnaki entered this layered system as regulators rather than disruptors. This has implications for how they lived. They did not arrive to impose entirely new ways of life. They adapted themselves to an environment that already had customs, expectations, and rhythms. Their presence had to fit within those rhythms to be effective. A god who disrupted daily life too violently risked collapsing the very order they were meant to preserve. This explains the emphasis on continuity in the texts. Changes happen, but they are framed as adjustments rather than revolutions. Even disasters are described as resets rather than replacements. Floods do not end existence. They clear it so it can begin again along familiar lines. The structured nature of the world also explains why divine needs became formalized. In a chaotic world, needs are unpredictable. In an ordered world, they become regular. The Anunnaki required offerings not because they lacked power, but because the system that sustained them depended on repetition. A structured world runs on schedule. Temples illustrate this perfectly. They are not portrayed as spontaneous gathering places. They are institutions. They store food. They employ workers. They operate daily. Their existence assumes a world where supply chains function, where surplus can be accumulated, and where labour can be coordinated. None of this is possible without prior structure. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and fate, are deeply tied to these institutions. Judgment requires records. Fate requires precedent. Decisions require memory. A structured world produces all three. An unstructured one cannot. This also affects how we understand divine residence. The gods do not wander aimlessly through the world. They inhabit defined spaces. Mountains, temples, cities, and subterranean realms are all assigned. These locations are not arbitrary. They reflect the organization of the world itself. High places correspond to authority. Low places correspond to judgment. Central places correspond to administration. The Anunnaki are often associated with the underworld, but this does not mean they existed in darkness or isolation. The underworld in Sumerian thought is not a chaotic abyss. It is a regulated realm with gates, rules, and officials. Souls enter. Judgments are made. Outcomes are assigned. This mirrors the structure of the living world rather than opposing it. A structured world produces structured afterlives. This continuity between realms reinforces the idea that the Anunnaki functioned within an established order rather than outside it. Their lifestyle reflected this. They were not free to act without consequence. Their decisions affected systems that were already in motion. Their presence had to align with existing frameworks. This alignment also explains why the gods depended on humans. Humans were not created into a void. They were placed into a functioning world that required upkeep. Their labour maintained canals, fields, temples, and cities. These were not optional features. They were essential components of stability. The gods benefited from this labour because it preserved the order they governed. The Anunnaki in particular benefited from continuity. Their authority depended on predictability. Fate could not be assigned if existence was unstable. Judgment could not be enforced if records were lost. Their role required a world that remembered itself. This is why chaos is treated as a threat rather than a neutral state. Chaos is not creative. It is destructive. It erases distinctions. It collapses systems. A structured world resists chaos through maintenance, and the Anunnaki are part of that resistance. This does not mean the world was static. Change occurs constantly, but within limits. Cities rise and fall. Dynasties end. Floods destroy and renew. But the underlying framework persists. Rivers still flow. Seasons still return. The gods still judge. The Anunnaki remain part of this continuity. Their way of life reflects acceptance of this condition. They did not seek to escape structure. They embodied it. Their routines, their consumption, their residence, and their authority all depended on the world remaining ordered. Their existence was not separate from the system. It was embedded within it. This understanding challenges modern assumptions. If the Anunnaki had arrived from elsewhere, bringing their own technologies and habits, we would expect disruption. We would expect new foods, new materials, new rhythms imposed from above. The texts do not show this. They show adaptation, integration, and continuity. The world they entered shaped them as much as they shaped it. This also explains why their presence becomes quieter over time. As systems stabilize, oversight can recede. Once routines are established, constant intervention is no longer necessary. The gods do not vanish. They withdraw. They become less visible because the structure holds. The Anunnaki's lifestyle evolves alongside this process. Early involvement gives way to institutional presence. Direct judgment becomes codified law. Personal interaction becomes ritual. Daily life continues without constant divine interruption. But this withdrawal does not mean absence. It means the world has learned to function. As we move forward, the focus will narrow from structure to substance, from the world that supported the Anunnaki to the specific practices that sustained them, from abstract order to physical nourishment, from systems to meals. The world they entered was already structured, and it is within that structure that everything about how they lived begins to make sense. Before agriculture shaped the land into fields and schedules, before ploughs cut straight lines through soil and harvests were counted and stored, sustenance existed in a far less controlled form. This earlier phase of existence is difficult to imagine from a modern perspective, and even difficult for the Sumerian scribes themselves to describe clearly. Their texts speak of it indirectly, through absence rather than detail, through what had not yet been established rather than what already was. Yet within those gaps, a picture begins to form of how the gods, including the Anunnaki, were sustained before the world learned how to feed itself in an organised way. In this early world, food was not produced. It emerged. Nourishment came from what already existed rather than from what had been cultivated. The land had not yet been disciplined into fields. Water flowed freely, sometimes too freely. Plants grew where conditions allowed, not where humans directed them. Animals moved without herds or enclosures. The environment provided, but it did so unevenly, unpredictably, and without regard for long-term planning. The gods existed within this environment, not above it. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of early Sumerian cosmology. The gods are often imagined as existing independently of material conditions, but the earliest texts suggest otherwise. Before agriculture, before temples functioned as storehouses, before humans were tasked with maintaining order, the gods drew sustenance directly from the world as it was. That sustenance was not refined, it was not processed, it was part of the same natural balance that sustained all living things. Water plays the central role here. In the oldest layers of Sumerian thought, water is not simply a resource, it is the foundation of existence itself. Fresh water in particular is treated as the source of vitality, wisdom, and continuity. It flows beneath the land, emerges in springs, fills rivers, and recedes again. Long before grain or livestock appear in the texts, water is already sustaining life. For the gods, this water was more than nourishment. It was connection. It linked them to the primordial state that existed before differentiation, before labour, before scarcity. Drinking, bathing, and dwelling near water are not presented as luxuries. They are necessities tied to divine function. The Anunnaki, though later associated with judgment and fate, are descendants of this watery origin. Their sustenance in this early phase reflects that lineage. They are sustained by proximity to sources of life rather than by prepared meals. The texts do not describe them eating bread or drinking beer at this stage because those things do not yet exist in a meaningful way. What sustains them is presence within a living environment. This does not mean the gods consumed nothing tangible. It means consumption was unmarked. There were no rituals because there were no systems to support them. Nourishment occurred as part of existence itself, not as a scheduled activity. The gods were sustained by the same forces that sustained the world: flowing water, fertile ground, and the movement of energy through natural cycles. Plants in this early world grew without cultivation. Reeds, grasses, wild grains, and edible roots would have been available, though not in predictable quantities. The texts do not list them, but their existence is implied by later descriptions of humanity's primitive diet. If humans ate grasses and drank from ditches before agriculture, it follows that the gods existed within the same environment, though without the vulnerability that plagued mortals. The key difference lies not in what was consumed, but in dependence. Humans in this early state struggled. They survived. Their nourishment was barely sufficient. The gods, by contrast, were not threatened by scarcity in the same way. Their sustenance was tied to balance rather than quantity. As long as the world remained coherent, they remained sustained. This distinction is subtle, but important. The gods did not need excess, they needed continuity. A flowing river mattered more than a full granary. A stable environment mattered more than abundance. Before agriculture, sustenance was about maintaining conditions rather than accumulating resources. This is why the introduction of labour marks such a profound shift. When lesser gods are described as digging canals and shaping land, it signals that natural provision is no longer enough. The world has become more complex. Needs have increased. Maintenance has become work, and work requires reliable nourishment. This is the moment when the old mode of sustenance begins to fail. The gods grow weary. The texts describe complaint, exhaustion, and imbalance. These are not emotional metaphors. They are functional problems. The environment no longer provides effortlessly. Intervention is required. Organisation becomes necessary. Before this moment, the Anunnaki do not require structured diets, because the system itself does not require them. After it, everything changes. But staying with the earlier phase for a moment longer reveals something important about divine existence. The gods are not described as separate from the world's cycles. They rise and rest with them. Their presence is strongest where life concentrates. Marshes, rivers, and fertile plains are not just human resources, they are divine habitats. This helps explain why the earlier cities are imagined as sacred from their inception. They are not built on arbitrary ground. They are placed where sustenance already flows, where water emerges, where life gathers naturally. The gods are already there in a sense long before temples formalize their presence. The Anunnaki sustenance in this period is inseparable from place. They do not travel widely. They reside where conditions support them. This residence is not comfort-driven, it is functional. Certain environments sustain order better than others. Those environments attract divine presence. This idea persists even after agriculture develops. Temples continue to be built near water. Ritual purity emphasizes washing. Offerings include libations poured into the ground. These practices preserve memory of an earlier time when water itself was the primary sustainer. Food before agriculture was not absent. It was unstructured. There were no daily meals because there were no days defined by work and rest. Time itself was less rigid. Nourishment happened as needed, not as scheduled. The gods existed in this fluid state without strain because the system had not yet become demanding. But once demands increase, once labour intensifies, once human populations grow, this form of sustenance becomes insufficient. The creation of humanity is framed as a solution to labour, not to hunger. Yet hunger follows close behind. A working system must be fed. Fields must be planted. Surpluses must be stored. The gods, now dependent on that system for stability, begin to depend on its products for sustenance. This transition does not erase the earlier mode. It overlays it. Water remains sacred. Natural spaces remain powerful. But food becomes processed. Nourishment becomes prepared. Sustenance becomes ritualized. For the Anunnaki, this marks a shift from environmental sustenance to mediated sustenance. They are no longer sustained directly by the world. They are sustained by a world maintained by humans. This mediation creates distance. Before agriculture, the gods and the environment are tightly bound. After agriculture, the gods and humans become bound instead. The system changes its point of contact. Understanding this earlier phase helps explain why later rituals are so strict. They are compensations for lost immediacy. They recreate in controlled form a connection that once existed naturally. The gods once lived within the world's flow. Now they receive it through offerings. This is not decline, it is adaptation. The Anunnaki's sustenance evolves as the world evolves. What sustained them before agriculture was balance itself. Flowing water, living land, continuous movement. What sustains them afterward will be very different. As the narrative continues, attention will turn to that transformation, to the emergence of bread and beer, to the logic behind prepared food, to the reasons why the gods accepted what humans made rather than what the world simply offered. For now, it is enough to recognize that before fields and herds, before ovens and storage jars, the gods were sustained by a world that still fed itself, and that world would not last unchanged for long. Bread and beer appear in the Sumerian text not as luxuries, not as symbols of excess or indulgence, but as solutions. They are answers to a problem that emerged once the world moved beyond simple balance and into sustained complexity. When the gods accepted bread and beer, they were not adopting human habits out of imitation or preference. They were acknowledging a new logic of consumption, one shaped by labour, repetition, and the need to stabilise a world that could no longer sustain itself naturally. This is the point where nourishment becomes deliberate. Before this shift, sustenance flowed from the environment. After it, sustenance had to be produced. Bread and beer are not random foods. They are the end results of long processes. Grain must be grown, harvested, dried, stored, ground, mixed, and baked. Beer requires soaking, fermenting, timing, and care. These foods cannot exist without planning. They cannot appear spontaneously. Their presence signals a world that now operates on schedules rather than instincts. The gods' acceptance of these foods marks their integration into that system. Bread, in particular, represents control over time. Grain is harvested once or twice a year, but bread can be baked daily. This transforms a seasonal resource into a continuous supply. It allows stability where there would otherwise be fluctuation. For a world governed by cycles and fate, this matters deeply. Stability reduces unpredictability. Predictability preserves order. Beer performs a similar function, though in a different way. It preserves grain in liquid form. It concentrates calories. It transforms water into nourishment. In an environment where clean drinking water could be uncertain and grain could spoil, beer became a reliable source of sustenance. It was safer than water, easier to digest than raw grain, and deeply tied to communal life. The gods' consumption of beer reflects this practicality. There is nothing mystical in the way beer is described in offerings. It is measured, poured, and consumed regularly. Its presence in temple records is consistent and unremarkable. That is precisely what makes it significant. The gods are not being offered rare substances or exotic materials. They are being offered the most reliable products of human labour. This reliability is the key. Once labour becomes central to maintaining the world, consumption must align with labour's output. The gods no longer draw sustenance directly from land and water. They draw it from the results of human effort. Bread and beer are the clearest expressions of that effort. They are edible proof that the system is functioning. This also explains why meat, though present, is less central than modern imagination expects. Meat requires animals, and animals require long-term care. Slaughter reduces future supply. Grain, by contrast, multiplies. One harvest produces seed for the next. Bread and beer represent sustainability rather than immediacy. The gods' preference for these foods reflects long-term thinking. This preference is not framed as desire. It is framed as requirement. The texts do not describe gods choosing bread and beer because they enjoy them. They describe gods receiving them because they are appropriate to the world as it now exists, appropriate to the system humans have been tasked to maintain. This is why offerings are standardized. Different gods receive different quantities, but the types of food remain consistent. Bread and beer appear again and again. Their repetition is not monotony, it is reinforcement. Each offering confirms that the cycle continues. Fields were planted, harvest succeeded, labour was performed, order remains intact. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and fate, are deeply connected to this logic. Their role depends on continuity. Fate cannot be assigned in a world that does not repeat itself. Judgment cannot be rendered where records do not exist. Bread and beer, produced daily and recorded carefully, become part of the infrastructure that allows fate to function. Consumption becomes administrative. Temples operate like households. but on a larger scale. Bakers and brewers are employed full-time. Storage rooms are monitored. Distribution is tracked. These activities do not exist for human benefit alone. They exist to support divine presence. The gods do not cook, but their existence depends on those who do. This creates an asymmetrical relationship. Humans labour continuously. The gods receive continuously. In exchange, the gods maintain order, ensure fertility, and protect cities. This is not exploitation in the modern sense. It is mutual dependency within a hierarchical system. Each side performs its function. Each side relies on the other. Bread and beer sit at the centre of this exchange. They are humble foods, but they carry immense weight. They represent transformed nature. Grain is no longer wild. Water is no longer dangerous. Both have been disciplined. This discipline mirrors the gods' own role in the world. They are agents of order, not chaos. They accept foods that reflect that role. This logic also explains the emphasis on correct preparation. Poorly made bread is not acceptable. Spoiled beer is dangerous. These are not aesthetic concerns. They are functional. If offerings fail, the system falters. The gods withdraw not out of anger, but because the conditions required for their presence are no longer met. Withdrawal is a recurring theme in the texts. When temples fall into disrepair, when offerings lapse, when rituals are neglected, divine presence diminishes. The gods do not destroy immediately. They recede, crops fail, illness spreads. These outcomes reinforce the logic of consumption. Nourishment is not optional. It is maintenance. The Anunnaki's lives are shaped by this reality. They are not depicted as feasting endlessly. They are depicted as receiving regularly. Their sustenance is tied to schedules. Their existence is bound to routine. This routine does not diminish them. It defines them. This definition becomes clearer when contrasted with later mythologies. In many later traditions, gods eat ambrosia or nectar, substances that exist only for divine consumption. These foods separate gods from humans. Sumerian bread and beer do the opposite. They connect gods and humans through shared resources, even if those resources are prepared differently and offered asymmetrically. This connection is intentional. The Sumerians did not imagine a world where gods and humans existed in separate universes. They imagined a layered reality where interaction was constant and necessary. Bread and beer are the medium of that interaction. This also reframes the idea of sacrifice. Sacrifice is often imagined as loss, an animal killed, grain burned. But in this system, sacrifice is circulation. Food moves from field to temple to God. In return, stability flows back into the world. Nothing is wasted. Even smoke carries meaning, marking transformation rather than destruction. The gods' consumption is not physical in the human sense alone. It is systemic. They receive the product of labour as confirmation that order persists, that confirmation sustains them. This is why food is never incidental in the texts. Even when narratives focus on conflict or judgment, offerings appear in the background. They are assumed. Their absence is noteworthy. Their presence is stabilising. Bread and beer are always there, quietly supporting the cosmic structure. For the Anunnaki, this means their existence becomes inseparable from human routine. They depend on human labour not because they are weak, but because the world now requires mediation. Nature alone no longer suffices. This mediation introduces vulnerability. If humans fail, gods suffer. If gods withdraw, humans suffer. The system is tightly coupled. Bread and beer are the hinges on which it turns. This also explains why the gods are so concerned with excess and noise. Overproduction can be as destabilizing as scarcity. Crowded cities strain resources. Noise disrupts rhythm. The gods seek balance, not growth without limit. Bread and beer must be produced in proportion. Consumption must remain steady. The Anunnaki's judgments often reflect this concern. They are not arbiters of morality alone. They are regulators of balance. Their decisions aim to preserve the system that sustains them. Excess threatens that system just as surely as neglect. This brings us back to the logic of early consumption. Bread and beer are not just foods, they're instruments of order. They represent the world's transition from natural balance to managed stability. The gods accept them because they embody the new reality. Before this transition, sustenance flowed. After it, sustenance was scheduled. The Anunnaki adapted to this change not by rejecting it, but by integrating into it. Their lives became defined by routines they did not perform themselves, but which they depended upon entirely. As the narrative continues, attention will move beyond what was consumed to how consumption was framed, to meals as rituals rather than acts of eating, to the spaces where these offerings were received, to the rhythms that shaped divine days. Bread and beer established the logic. Everything that follows builds upon it. Sacred meals were never simply about nourishment. In the Sumerian understanding of the world, they were mechanisms through which the order of the cosmos was reaffirmed again and again. Every offering placed before a god was an act of alignment, a way of keeping the structure of existence from slipping out of place. Food, once it became ritualized, was no longer just sustenance. It became instruction. It told the world how to behave. This idea is difficult to grasp from a modern perspective, where meals are private, individual, and often disconnected from broader meaning. In the Sumerian world, meals given to the gods were public, procedural, and inseparable from cosmic stability. They were not moments of indulgence. They were moments of recalibration. The gods did not simply receive food, they received order. Once bread and beer became central to divine sustenance, the act of offering them acquired precise rules. The time mattered, the location mattered, the sequence mattered, the purity of the space mattered. These details were not arbitrary. Each element corresponded to a belief about how the universe remained coherent. A sacred meal followed the same logic as the cosmos itself. Everything had a place. Nothing was accidental. The temple functioned as the point where this logic was enacted. It was not merely a building, it was a model of the universe in miniature. The inner sanctuary represented controlled space. The outer courtyards represented the human realm. The thresholds between them marked transitions that had to be respected. When food crossed those thresholds, it did so according to strict procedures. This movement mirrored the movement of cosmic forces. The gods, including the Anunnaki, were believed to occupy specific domains within this ordered universe. Their meals reinforced those domains. A god associated with the underworld received offerings appropriate to judgment and stability. A god associated with fertility received offerings tied to growth and renewal. These distinctions mattered because they preserved differentiation. Differentiation prevented collapse. The Anunnaki, often described as judges and determiners of fate, were linked especially to meals that emphasized regularity rather than abundance. Their offerings were not extravagant, they were consistent. Day after day the same foods appeared. Bread, beer, sometimes meat, always measured. Consistency was power. A sacred meal repeated without interruption signaled that fate continued uninterrupted. Judgment remained possible. The dead would be assessed. The living would receive outcomes aligned with precedent. This continuity was essential. A break in ritual threatened more than divine displeasure. It threatened the logic of the world. This is why ritual neglect appears so often in the texts as a precursor to disaster. When offerings stop, the gods do not immediately destroy. Instead, disorder creeps in. Crops fail. Floods arrive unpredictably. Illness spreads. These events are not framed as punishments inflicted by angry deities. They are framed as consequences of misalignment. The cosmic machinery loses calibration. Sacred meals functioned as recalibration points. They reminded the gods of their roles, and they reminded humans of theirs. Humans prepared and presented. Gods received and responded. This exchange reinforced hierarchy without requiring constant intervention. The system worked because it repeated itself. The Anunnaki's participation in these meals reflects their position within this system. They were not remote figures observing from beyond the cosmos. They were embedded within its processes. Their authority was exercised through continuity, not spectacle. This is why the imagery of divine feasting is subdued in Sumerian texts. There are no descriptions of overflowing tables or ecstatic banquets. Instead, there are lists, records, inventories. The sacred meal is bureaucratic by design. Bureaucracy ensures stability. This does not make the ritual cold or empty. On the contrary, it invests ordinary materials with enormous significance. A loaf of bread becomes a stabilizing force. A jar of beer becomes a guarantor of order. The simplicity of the food emphasizes its role. It is not about pleasure, it is about function. The gods did not need novelty. Novelty introduced unpredictability. Sacred meals also structured time. Offerings marked days, festivals marked seasons. Special meals accompanied transitions, new kings, completed temples, the end of crises. These meals did not celebrate change. They managed it. They absorbed disruption into ritual so that the system could continue. For the Anunnaki, whose role involved judgment and fate, these temporal markers were especially important. Fate is not static. It unfolds. Sacred meals punctuated that unfolding. They created moments where outcomes could be adjusted without tearing the fabric of existence. This adjustment is subtle in the texts, but it is there. Before major decisions, offerings are made. After disasters, offerings resume. These meals bookend events. They do not erase what has happened. They integrate it. The cosmic order in this view is not fragile, but it is sensitive. It responds to maintenance. Sacred meals are one of its maintenance tools. The spatial arrangement of meals reinforces this idea further. Food offered to the gods is placed deliberately. It is not scattered. It is not consumed in chaos. Even the smoke from burnt offerings is described as rising in controlled ways, pleasing because it moves correctly, not because it smells good. Movement matters. Everything in the ritual meal flows along prescribed paths, from kitchen to altar, from altar to God, from God back into the world as blessing or stability. This circulation mirrors the movement of water through canals, grain through storage, and law through society. The Anunnaki sit within this circulation as fixed points. They are not the source of flow nor its endpoint. They are regulators. Their presence ensures that movement does not become disorder. Their meals affirm that regulation is still possible. This understanding also explains why sacred meals often precede acts of judgment. In stories where decisions are rendered, offerings appear first. The gods are sustained, the system is reaffirmed. Only then does judgment occur. The sequence matters. Judgment without sustenance would be unstable. The Anunnaki's lives are structured around these rhythms. They are not constantly eating. They are constantly present at the point where order is renewed. Their sustenance is tied to that presence. They do not withdraw from meals because meals are where their authority is exercised. This is very different from later depictions of divine consumption as symbolic or metaphorical. In the Sumerian worldview, the sacred meal is operational. It does something. It keeps the world running. This also sheds light on why humans were created in the first place. Labour produces food. Food sustains gods. Sustained gods maintain order. Maintained order allows human society to exist. The loop is complete. Sacred meals sit at the centre of that loop. Without them, the system fails. The Anunnaki are neither parasites nor distant rulers in this arrangement. They are participants whose needs align with the world's needs. Their sustenance and the cosmos' stability are the same thing viewed from different angles. As the narrative continues, attention will shift toward how these sacred rhythms shaped daily existence. Not just what was eaten, but when. Not just where meals occurred, but how they structured divine days. For now, it is enough to recognise that sacred meals were not celebrations. They were calibrations. They kept the universe from drifting. And the Anunnaki, seated quietly within those rituals, depended on that precision more than any spectacle ever could. Labour and rest were not human inventions projected upward onto the gods. In the Sumerian worldview, they were foundational rhythms woven into existence itself. Long before humans organised their days around work and sleep, the divine realm was already understood as operating within cycles of exertion and withdrawal. These cycles were not signs of weakness, they were signs of order. Even the gods, including the Anunnaki, didn't exist in a state of constant action. Their power depended on rhythm. The earliest texts make this clear indirectly. They describe moments when the gods are active and moments when they are not, times when decisions are rendered and times when silence prevails, periods of intervention followed by long stretches of observation. This pattern is not accidental. It reflects an understanding that uninterrupted activity leads to instability. Rest is not absence, it is preparation. The Anunnaki, whose role centres on judgment and the maintenance of fate, are especially bound to this rhythm. Judgment cannot be continuous. If it were, outcomes would lose meaning. Decisions require intervals. Fate unfolds over time, not all at once. The Anunnaki's days are therefore structured not by constant motion, but by alternating phases of engagement and withdrawal. This structure mirrors the world they oversee. Fields are worked, then left fallow. Rivers flood, then recede. Cities bustle, then quiet. The cosmos breathes. Divine life follows the same pattern. The gods do not stand apart from these cycles. They embody them. Labour in the divine realm does not resemble human labour, but it is still labour. The Anunnaki do not dig canals or bake bread, but they do preside over processes that require sustained attention. They sit in judgment. They fix outcomes. They uphold boundaries between realms. These tasks are not physically exhausting, but they are stabilizing. They require presence, clarity, and continuity. Presence, however, cannot be constant. The texts often describe gods retreating to their abodes. This retreat is sometimes interpreted as abandonment, but that is a misunderstanding. Withdrawal is part of function. A god who never withdraws erodes the boundary between divine and human. That boundary is essential. Without it, order collapses. Rest preserves distinction. When the gods withdraw, the world continues to operate. Fields grow. People labour. Offerings are prepared. This continuation is not evidence of divine absence. It is evidence that the system is working. The gods do not need to intervene constantly, because their earlier interventions established routines that now sustain themselves. The Anunnaki's rest periods reflect this confidence. They do not sleep in the human sense, but the texts do describe them as being at ease, settled, withdrawn from immediate engagement. This state is not inactivity, it is readiness. It allows them to return to judgment without distortion caused by overextension. Overextension is a recurring danger in the texts. When the gods are burdened too heavily, disorder follows. The narrative of lesser gods rebelling because of excessive labour is one example. The flood, triggered in part by divine irritation caused by human noise, is another. These stories emphasise limits. Even divine patience has boundaries. Even divine attention can be strained. Rest prevents rupture. The rhythm of divine days is therefore not arbitrary. It is protective. It ensures that power remains stable rather than volatile. The Anunnaki's authority depends on measured engagement. Too much involvement would collapse hierarchy. Too little would invite chaos. This balance shapes their daily existence. They are not portrayed as endlessly occupied. They are portrayed as available at the right moments. Their judgments arrive when necessary, not constantly. Their presence is felt more through structure than through spectacle. Time plays a crucial role here. Divine days are not identical to human days, but they are structured. Festivals, offerings, and rituals occur at specific intervals. These intervals align human time with divine time. They create points of synchronization where interaction becomes possible. Between these points, the gods remain present but not intrusive. The Anunnaki, in particular, are associated with moments of transition, death, judgment, the fixing of fate. These events do not occur continuously. They occur when thresholds are crossed. Their rhythm is therefore uneven by design. Long stretches of waiting punctuated by decisive moments. Waiting is not passivity. It is part of the role. The underworld, often associated with the Anunnaki, reflects this rhythm perfectly. It is not a place of constant activity. Souls arrive, they are assessed, they move on. Long periods pass between these events. The judges remain, but they are not always engaged. Their authority persists even in stillness. This stillness is essential to their power. A judge who never pauses loses perspective. A fate that is constantly adjusted loses meaning. The Anunnaki's rest preserves the weight of their decisions. When they act, it matters because they do not act frivolously. This also explains why divine anger is so disruptive in the texts. When the gods are provoked into excessive action, the rhythm breaks. Floods, plagues, and disasters represent moments when balance fails. These events are not routine. They are emergency measures. They occur when the normal rhythm can no longer sustain order. After such events, rest returns. Offerings resume. Temples are repaired. Rituals re-establish cadence. The gods withdraw again. The system resets. The Anunnaki resume their measured role. This cyclical pattern is everywhere in the texts, even when it is not explicitly stated. It governs the structure of myths, the timing of rituals, and the expectations placed on both gods and humans. Human labour fits into this pattern as well. Humans work so that the gods do not have to. This is not exploitation, it is delegation. By assigning physical labour to humans, the gods preserve their own rhythm. They avoid overextension. They maintain their capacity for judgment and oversight. This delegation shapes the rhythm of divine days indirectly. Because humans work continuously, the gods can engage intermittently. Because offerings are prepared daily, divine sustenance does not require constant attention. The system buffers divine involvement, allowing rest without collapse. The Anunnaki benefit from this buffering more than most. Their role is not creative, it is adjudicative. They step in when outcomes must be fixed, not when processes must be run. This makes their rhythm even more discontinuous. Long periods of stability punctuated by decisive action. This rhythm also affects how divine presence is perceived. To humans, the gods may seem distant at times. Prayers go unanswered. Signs do not appear. This is not neglect. It is rest. It is the system functioning as intended. Divine silence is part of divine order. The texts do not frame this silence as absence. They frame it as waiting. Waiting preserves hierarchy. It reminds humans that gods are not tools to be summoned at will. They act on their own schedule, aligned with cosmic rhythm rather than individual desire. The Anunnaki embody this principle strongly. Their judgments are final precisely because they are rare. Their involvement carries weight because it is not constant. Their authority depends on restraint. This restraint shapes their daily existence. They are not busy in the human sense. They are not idle either. They exist in a state of readiness. Their rest is active. Their labour is precise. This way of living contrasts sharply with modern interpretations that imagine gods as either constantly active or completely withdrawn. The Sumerian texts present a more nuanced picture. Divine life is rhythmic, not binary. Action and rest are complementary. The rhythm of divine days also reinforces the separation between realms. Humans cannot mirror divine time perfectly. They must labour more frequently. Their rest is shorter. Their cycles are faster. This difference maintains hierarchy, without requiring constant enforcement. The Anunnaki's slower rhythm places them above human urgency. They do not respond immediately, they respond appropriately. This distinction is subtle, but it is crucial. It defines the tone of divine interaction throughout the texts. As the narrative moves forward, this rhythm will become even more apparent in descriptions of where the gods reside, how they withdraw, and how their presence becomes more distant over time. Their lifestyle evolves alongside the world's increasing ability to sustain itself without constant oversight. For now, it is enough to understand that labour and rest were not opposites in the divine realm. They were partners. The Anunnaki lived within a rhythm that preserved their authority, maintained cosmic balance, and allowed the world to continue without collapsing under the weight of constant intervention. Their days were not endless feasts or ceaseless work. They were measured, and in that measure their power endured. Homes, temples, and places of withdrawal were not interchangeable spaces in the Sumerian understanding of divine life. Each served a specific function, and together they formed the architecture of how gods remained present without being overwhelmed by the world they governed. For the Anunnaki in particular, these spaces defined how authority could be exercised while still preserving distance, how judgment could occur without constant exposure, and how divine existence could continue without dissolving into chaos. The idea that gods needed places to withdraw may feel counterintuitive at first. Modern imagination often treats divine beings as omnipresent, existing everywhere at once, immune to strain or intrusion. The Sumerian texts present something very different. They describe gods who reside, who settle, who occupy locations not because they are confined, but because presence itself must be managed. A god without a place is a god without boundaries. In the earliest texts, divine residence is always described in concrete terms. Gods dwell in mountains, in temples, in cities, beneath the earth, or within the depths of water. These locations are not symbolic abstractions. They are functional zones where divine activity can occur under controlled conditions. They allow the gods to interact with the world selectively rather than continuously. The Anunnaki, associated primarily with judgment, fate, and the underworld, are especially tied to this idea of controlled presence. Their authority does not require constant visibility. In fact, visibility undermines their function. Judgment gains weight when it emerges from silence. Fate becomes final when it is not endlessly revised. This is why withdrawal matters. Temples serve as the most visible form of divine residence, but they are not homes in the human sense. They are interfaces, carefully constructed environments where divine presence can be concentrated without spilling into daily life. Temples regulate access. Not everyone enters. Not everything crosses the threshold. Inside, purity is enforced, noise is reduced, movement is controlled. These constraints are not ceremonial excess. They are protective measures. The gods are not imagined as fragile, but the system they inhabit is. Too much contact destabilizes order. Too little contact erodes authority. The temple sits between these extremes. It allows regular interaction without constant intrusion. For the Anunnaki, whose role is less about blessing crops and more about maintaining cosmic law, temples function differently than they do for other gods. They are not places of frequent celebration. They are places of acknowledgement. Offerings are made, presence is affirmed, but intimacy is limited. The texts suggest that the Anunnaki do not dwell permanently in temples. Instead, temples act as access points, places where their attention can be directed when necessary. This distinction is subtle, but important. A god who lives everywhere cannot withdraw. A god who lives nowhere cannot be approached. Withdrawal requires residence elsewhere. The underworld fills this role for the Anunnaki. Contrary to later traditions that imagine the underworld as chaotic or torturous, the Sumerian underworld is ordered, bureaucratic and regulated. It has gates, it has officials, it has rules that apply equally to all who enter. It is not a place of punishment so much as a place of sorting. This makes it an ideal domain for beings concerned with fate. The Anunnaki's association with this realm reflects their need for distance. From below the surface of the world, they can observe without being overwhelmed. They can judge without being distracted. They can exist within time without being dragged into its urgency. This does not mean they are absent from the surface world. It means their presence is mediated. When the Anunnaki act, they do so through institutions, through laws, through omens, through outcomes that unfold rather than events that explode. Their home is not where they intervene. Their home is where they retreat to preserve perspective. Perspective requires separation. This separation is reinforced by the way divine dwellings are described. Gods are said to sit, to rest, to dwell in silence. These descriptions are not metaphors for inactivity. They are descriptions of containment. A god seated on a throne is a god who is stable, not restless. A god dwelling in a fixed place is a god whose authority does not depend on movement. Movement belongs to messengers and forces, not judges. Homes, in this context, are places where divine identity remains intact. Without them, gods risk becoming indistinguishable from the world they govern. The Anunnaki in particular require clear separation because their judgments must appear impartial. They cannot be seen as participants in daily life if they are to decide its outcomes. This is why their withdrawal is not abandonment. It is a necessary condition for authority. The texts often describe gods retreating after periods of intense interaction, after creation, after disaster, after judgment. This retreat signals a return to equilibrium. The gods have acted. Now the world must absorb the consequences. Constant divine presence would interfere with that process. Homes provide the space for this pause. Temples, by contrast, provide continuity. Even when gods withdraw, their institutions remain active. Priests continue rituals. Offerings continue. Calendars continue. This continuity ensures that withdrawal does not become absence. The gods are still acknowledged. Their authority is still recognized. But they are not constantly engaged. This layered presence allows the world to function independently. For the Anunnaki, this independence is especially important. Fate must unfold according to established decisions. If gods interfered constantly, fate would lose coherence. Their withdrawal protects the integrity of what has already been fixed. The idea of divine homes also shapes how humans perceive silence. When prayers go unanswered, it is not because the gods are gone. It is because they are at home, withdrawn, observing rather than responding. This understanding reframes silence as a form of presence rather than its absence. The Sumerian texts do not depict gods as obligated to respond immediately. Response is discretionary. It occurs when thresholds are crossed, not when requests are made. Homes allow gods to remain selective. This selectivity is a form of power. The Anunnaki's lifestyle reflects this. They are not depicted wandering the earth or appearing casually. Their appearances are formal, structured, often mediated through dreams, omens, or authorized representatives. These forms of contact preserve distance while allowing communication. Distance is not coldness. It is control. The spatial separation between divine homes and human spaces reinforces hierarchy without violence. Humans do not need to be reminded constantly of divine authority, because the architecture itself communicates it. Temples rise above the city. Underworld gates lie beneath it. Homes of gods are placed where access is limited by design. This design shapes behavior. People lower their voices in temples. They wash before entering. They follow procedures. These behaviors are not expressions of fear alone. They are acknowledgements of proximity. The closer one comes to divine space, the more carefully one must behave. The Anunnaki benefit from this system more than most. Their authority does not rely on spectacle. It relies on inevitability. Fate arrives not with noise but with certainty. Their withdrawal allows that certainty to accumulate. This also explains why gods are often described as returning to their dwellings after judgment. Once a decision is made, the gods retreat. They do not linger to explain or justify. The outcome stands. The world must adjust. The gods' withdrawal signals finality. Without this withdrawal, decisions would feel negotiable. Homes, then, are not places of rest alone. They are places where decisions become fixed, where perspective is regained, where gods are insulated from the immediate consequences of their actions, so that those consequences can unfold without interference. The Anunnaki's residence in the underworld serves this function perfectly. They are close enough to observe outcomes, but far enough to remain unaffected by daily fluctuations. Their judgments shape the world above without being distorted by it. This arrangement also preserves continuity across generations. Cities rise and fall, kings change, dynasties collapse, but divine homes endure, temples may be rebuilt, underworld realms persist. The gods' withdrawal ensures that their authority outlasts any single human era. This permanence is essential to the Anunnaki's role. Fate does not belong to one generation. It spans lifetimes. Their homes anchor that span. As time passes, the text suggests that divine presence becomes quieter, not because gods weaken, but because systems strengthen. Once institutions can function without constant oversight, gods withdraw more deeply. Their homes become more distant, their appearances more rare. This gradual withdrawal does not erase their influence, it embeds it. Law replaces direct judgment, ritual replaces direct instruction, memory replaces presence. The gods' homes recede into mythic space, but their decisions remain encoded in structure. For the Anunnaki, this evolution is especially pronounced. Their authority becomes abstracted, less visible, more absolute. They no longer need to appear because their judgments are already in place. But even then, the idea of home remains. There is always a place they return to, a space beyond reach, a realm where divine identity is preserved. This understanding reshapes how we imagine their lives. They are not constantly engaged. They are not absent. They exist within a pattern of approach and withdrawal, presence and distance. Their homes are not escapes. They are stabilizers. As the narrative continues, attention will shift from where the gods reside to how these spaces shape human behavior, how temples organize daily life, how withdrawal changes relationships, how presence becomes memory. For now, it is enough to recognize that the Anunnaki did not live everywhere. They lived somewhere, and in that somewhere, their power remained intact precisely because it was protected by distance. Cleanliness in the Sumerian world was never about comfort, and it was never about aesthetics. It was about control. It was about keeping the boundaries of existence intact in a reality where disorder was always waiting to seep in. Ritual cleanliness, especially in relation to the gods, and most critically in relation to beings like the Anunnaki, functioned as a defensive measure against collapse, rather than a pursuit of purity for its own sake. The fear of disorder runs quietly beneath almost every surviving Sumerian text. Not chaos as an abstract concept, but disorder as a practical threat. Floodwaters breaking their banks, crops failing, disease spreading through crowded cities, social hierarchies unravelling, divine favour withdrawing without warning. These were not distant possibilities. They were lived realities. Cleanliness and ritual existed to keep these forces contained. For the gods, cleanliness was not optional, it was structural. The divine realm was imagined as orderly by definition, but that order was not self-sustaining. It had to be protected from contamination. Contamination did not mean dirt in a modern sense. It meant anything that blurred categories. Death entering spaces meant for life. Noise entering spaces meant for silence. Improper behaviour entering spaces meant for restraint. Once boundaries blurred, the system weakened. The Anunnaki, whose function depended entirely on clear boundaries, were especially sensitive to this threat. Judgment cannot occur in disorder. Fate cannot be fixed in a contaminated environment. Decisions lose authority when the space in which they are made is unstable. This is why rituals surrounding the Anunnaki emphasize separation, washing, silence, and controlled movement. Cleanliness begins with water. Water in Sumerian thought is not simply cleansing, it is resetting. Washing removes not only physical residue but narrative residue. It erases what has just happened so that something new can occur without interference. Priests washed before entering sacred spaces not because gods disliked dirt, but because past actions had to be left behind at the threshold. The gods themselves are repeatedly described as associated with clean waters, sweet waters, flowing waters. These are not poetic flourishes. They mark domains that are stable and life-supporting rather than stagnant or destructive. Flowing water carries disorder away. Still water allows it to accumulate. For the Anunnaki, whose judgments often occur after death, this distinction is crucial. Death is the ultimate boundary crossing. It brings with it the greatest risk of contamination. The underworld is orderly not because it is clean in a physical sense, but because its rules are absolute. Nothing escapes. Nothing moves freely. The danger lies not in the underworld itself, but in improper contact between realms. This is why rituals surrounding death are so strict. Bodies are washed, spaces are purified, words are spoken in prescribed sequences. These actions do not comfort the dead. They protect the living and the gods from disorder spilling across boundaries. The Anunnaki preside over these thresholds. Their authority depends on them remaining intact. Cleanliness, in this sense, is containment. Temples reflect this principle clearly. They are spaces where everything is regulated. Footwear is removed or restricted. Noise is limited. Movement follows paths. Objects are handled only by authorized individuals. These constraints are not symbolic. They are preventative. A temple that becomes careless invites imbalance. The texts often link ritual failure with divine withdrawal. This withdrawal is not emotional, it is mechanical. When a space can no longer maintain the conditions required for divine presence, that presence recedes. The gods do not linger where disorder accumulates. The Anunnaki, being less forgiving than many other gods, withdraw quickly when boundaries are violated. This is not cruelty, it is necessity. Their role requires clarity. They cannot judge within contamination. They cannot fix fate where categories collapse. Cleanliness preserves the conditions that make their function possible. This fear of disorder extends into language itself. Certain words are avoided in sacred contexts. Others must be spoken precisely. Speech, like space, can contaminate. Incorrect words disrupt sequence. Sequence matters because sequence reflects order. When sequence breaks, outcomes become unpredictable. The Anunnaki's judgments rely on correct sequence. Who enters first? Who speaks? Who waits? These details are never arbitrary. They mirror the structure of the cosmos as the Sumerians understood it. Everything has a place. Everything has a time. Ritual enforces memory. Without ritual, memory erodes. People forget procedures. Boundaries blur. Cleanliness fades. Disorder grows. The gods respond not with immediate destruction, but with distance. Crops fail not because gods are angry, but because the system has lost calibration. The Anunnaki's presence is especially tied to calibration. They do not intervene to fix minor disturbances. They appear when imbalance reaches a threshold. Their judgments reset systems rather than adjust them gradually. This makes their involvement rare and severe. Ritual cleanliness exists to prevent reaching that threshold. This is why daily rituals matter more than grand ceremonies. Small acts of washing, regular offerings, controlled behavior. These maintain stability so that dramatic intervention is unnecessary. The gods prefer routine maintenance over catastrophe. The Anunnaki embody this preference. They are not gods of spectacle, they are gods of consequence. Their silence is a sign that things are functioning. Their appearance signals failure at a systemic level. This relationship creates anxiety. Humans live with the knowledge that disorder accumulates invisibly. Noise builds, impurity spreads, neglect compounds. Ritual is the only defense against this slow decay. Cleanliness is vigilance made visible. The fear of disorder is therefore not superstition, it is awareness. The Sumerians understood that systems collapse gradually, before they collapse suddenly. Ritual addresses the gradual phase. The Anunnaki address the sudden one. This division of responsibility shapes divine life profoundly. Gods who bless crops engage frequently. Gods who judge appear rarely. Gods who judge must remain insulated from daily contamination so that their decisions remain final. This insulation requires strict cleanliness. The Anunnaki do not walk freely among humans because proximity invites impurity. They do not speak casually because language carries residue. They do not reside in busy spaces because noise erodes clarity. Their withdrawal is protective, not aloof. Cleanliness also shapes divine consumption. Food offered to the gods must be prepared under controlled conditions. Ingredients matter. Handling matters. Timing matters. Spoiled offerings are not insulting. They are dangerous. They introduce decay into spaces meant for order. This is why food preparation is ritualized. The gods do not eat randomly. Their sustenance is integrated into a system that maintains boundaries. Bread baked improperly is not simply poor quality, it is unstable. Beer brewed incorrectly ferments unpredictably. Unpredictability threatens order. The Anunnaki depend on stability above all else. Their fear is not hunger, it is disorder. This fear explains much about their behavior in the myths. When humans multiply too rapidly, noise increases. Noise represents uncontrolled growth. Uncontrolled growth overwhelms systems. The Siods respond by reducing population, not out of malice, but out of necessity. When rituals fail, disasters follow. Not because gods are offended, but because maintenance has ceased. The system reaches a breaking point. The Anunnaki's judgments often appear harsh, because they address advanced failure rather than early warning signs. Cleanliness is the early warning system. It alerts the community to imbalance before catastrophe becomes inevitable. Ritual failure is visible, neglect is noticeable. These signals allow correction before divine judgment becomes necessary. This makes ritual a form of collective responsibility. Everyone participates. Everyone contributes. Cleanliness is not confined to priests. It extends into homes, streets, and daily behavior. Disorder anywhere threatens order everywhere. The Anunnaki observe this quietly. They do not correct minor errors. They assess patterns. When patterns degrade beyond repair, judgment follows. This perspective reframes divine justice. Justice is not moral condemnation. It is systemic correction. The Anunnaki do not punish sin. They reset systems. Cleanliness delays the need for resetting. This is why the texts emphasize repetition. Rituals are not innovative. They do not evolve quickly. Change introduces unpredictability. Stability preserves order. The fear of disorder also explains resistance to novelty. New practices are suspect. New foods require careful integration. New behaviors must be tested. Sudden change risks imbalance. The gods favor continuity. The Anunnaki, as guardians of fate, embody this conservatism. They represent the weight of precedent. What has worked before is preferable to what might work now. Their judgments preserve memory rather than encourage experimentation. This makes them appear distant and severe, but that severity is protective. Without it, the world would dissolve into constant adjustment, never stabilizing long enough to sustain life. Cleanliness, then, is not moral purity. It is boundary maintenance. Ritual is not worship alone. It is calibration. The fear of disorder is not paranoia. It is realism born from living in a fragile system. The Anunnaki live at the edge of that fragility. Their lives are shaped by avoidance rather than indulgence, by restraint rather than expression, by withdrawal rather than presence. They exist to ensure that when order fails completely, something remains capable of restoring it. As the narrative continues, this fear will shape how humans are brought into the system more deeply, why they prepare food, why they limit behaviour, why they accept constraints. Cleanliness and ritual are the quiet labour that prevents judgment, and the Anunnaki, watching from spaces kept deliberately untouched, depend on that labour more than on any offering ever placed before them. Humans prepared what the gods consumed because the system demanded mediation. This was not a matter of devotion alone, and it was not a symbolic gesture meant to flatter divine pride. It was a practical arrangement rooted in necessity, hierarchy, and control. The gods, including the Anunnaki, did not gather food for themselves because their role in the world required distance from the processes that sustained it. Preparation was assigned downward so that authority could remain intact upward. This division begins with labour. From the moment humans appear in the Sumerian texts, their purpose is stated with unusual clarity. They are created to relieve the gods of work, not metaphorical work, but real, exhausting labour that had become incompatible with divine function. The gods had already discovered that maintaining the world required effort. Canals had to be dug, fields had to be shaped, order demanded constant input. That demand threatened divine balance. Humans were introduced to absorb it. Once humans take on labour, everything else follows logically. If humans dig canals, they control water. If they control water, they control agriculture. If they control agriculture, they control food production. And if food production becomes human responsibility, then preparation becomes human responsibility as well. The gods do not cook because cooking is labour. Cooking transforms raw material into something stable and usable. It requires heat, timing, and attention. It is repetitive. It binds the preparer to daily routine. For humans, this routine is acceptable. For gods, it is destabilizing. Their role requires separation from repetition, not immersion in it. This is why offerings are prepared, not gathered. The gods receive food that already reflects order. Grain has been harvested and stored. Bread has been baked. Beer has been fermented. Animals have been selected and slaughtered correctly. Each step represents successful management of the world. When the gods receive these products, they are not receiving nourishment alone. They are receiving confirmation that the system is functioning. Humans become the interface. This interface is essential because the gods cannot directly interact with raw disorder without consequence. Raw nature is unpredictable. It floods. It decays. It resists control. Human labour filters that unpredictability. It refines it into stable outputs. The gods accept those outputs because they are usable within a structured cosmos. The Anunnaki, whose authority depends on clarity and finality, require this filtering more than most. Their judgments must be rendered within a system that is already stabilized. If they were to engage directly with raw production, their perspective would be compromised. They would become participants rather than arbiters. Preparation preserves impartiality. This also explains why the texts emphasize correct preparation so heavily. Improper offerings are not insults. They are failures of mediation. A poorly prepared meal represents a breakdown in human responsibility. The gods respond not because their preferences have been violated, but because the system has demonstrated instability. Humans prepare what the gods consume because humans are closer to disorder. They live within it, they handle it daily. They touch raw materials, they experience decay, hunger, and exhaustion. These experiences make them suitable mediators. They absorb disorder so that the gods do not have to. This is not demeaning in the Sumerian worldview, it is functional. Humanity's role is not to be elevated above nature. It is to stand between nature and the divine, to take what is wild and make it usable, to take what is unstable and make it repeatable. Food preparation is the clearest expression of this role. A loaf of bread represents days of labour, fields planted, grain harvested, flour ground, dough mixed, heat applied, time measured. Each step moves the world from uncertainty toward reliability. When the gods receive bread, they receive the end of that chain. Beer carries this logic even more clearly. Fermentation is dangerous if unmanaged. It can spoil, it can sour, it can fail entirely. Successful beer production proves that humans have learned to work with time rather than against it. They allow transformation to occur without losing control. This is precisely the kind of competence the gods require from those who sustain the system. The gods do not teach this daily. They judge whether it has been done. This separation allows divine life to remain stable. The gods do not need to adjust to every fluctuation. They respond only when patterns fail consistently. Human preparation acts as a buffer, smoothing irregularities before they reach divine attention. The Anunnaki benefit from this buffering enormously. Their role is not to oversee daily production. It is to intervene when fate must be fixed. If they were involved in preparation, they would be drawn into constant correction. Their authority would dissolve into management. By placing preparation in human hands, the gods preserve distance. Distance preserves hierarchy. This hierarchy is not maintained through force, but through function. Humans labour because they can. Gods judge because they must. Each role depends on the other, but they are not interchangeable. This arrangement also explains why humans are accountable. When offerings fail, responsibility does not fall on the gods, it falls on the community. Famine is not framed as divine cruelty, it is framed as systemic breakdown. Something in the chain failed. Labour was neglected, ritual was ignored, preparation faltered. The gods respond to failure, not to effort. This distinction matters. Humans are not punished for struggling, they are corrected for neglect. Preparation is expected, not perfection. The system tolerates variation. It does not tolerate abandonment. The Anunnaki's judgments often follow long periods of warning. Ritual lapses accumulate, cleanliness declines, offerings become irregular. These are signs that humans are no longer fulfilling their mediating role. The gods withdraw first, judgment follows later. Destruction is a last resort, not a first response. This sequence underscores why preparation is central. It is the daily labour that prevents catastrophe. It keeps divine involvement minimal. It allows the world to run on its own momentum. Humans prepare what the gods consume because preparation is what keeps gods distant. This distance is not rejection. It is protection. The Sumerian texts repeatedly show what happens when this distance collapses. When gods are forced into direct engagement with disorder, consequences escalate quickly. Floods, plagues, resets. These are not expressions of divine temperament. They are signs that mediation has failed completely. Human preparation exists to prevent that failure. This gives ordinary labour immense significance. Baking bread is not just survival. Brewing beer is not just nourishment. These acts sustain cosmic order. They allow the gods to remain judges rather than labourers. They preserve the structure of existence. The Anunnaki's consumption, then, is not passive, it is evaluative. By accepting prepared food, they acknowledge that the world remains under control. By withholding favour when preparation fails, they signal that intervention may be approaching. This dynamic also shapes human identity. Humans are not servants in the modern sense. They are custodians. They maintain the interface between raw reality and divine order. Their labour is heavy, but it is meaningful. Without it, the gods cannot function as intended. This is why the texts do not romanticize human existence. Labour is difficult. Routine is demanding. Failure has consequences. But this difficulty is framed as necessary. The alternative is instability at every level. The Anunnaki do not consume what humans eat casually. They consume what humans prepare deliberately. That difference matters. It marks the boundary between survival and order. between chaos and structure, between a world that collapses and one that endures. As the narrative continues, this preparation will take on another dimension. Not just food, but knowledge. Not just sustenance, but limitation. Humans will not only feed the gods, they will also absorb constraints meant to preserve balance. For now, it is enough to see that human hands shaped what divine presence could accept, and in doing so, they shaped the rhythm of the world itself. Daily life without omnipotence is one of the most difficult ideas to accept when thinking about gods, yet it is one of the clearest implications that emerges from the Sumerian texts when they are read carefully. The Anunnaki are powerful, authoritative, and enduring, but they are not portrayed as limitless beings who exist beyond constraint. Their existence unfolds within a system that restricts them even as it empowers them. They are not omnipotent in the sense later theologies would demand. They live within boundaries, routines, and dependencies that shape their daily reality. This does not weaken them. It defines them. Omnipotence would make daily life meaningless. A being that can do everything at all times has no reason to rest, no need to withdraw, and no dependence on structure. Such a being would not require rituals, offerings, or intermediaries, yet the entire Sumerian religious system is built around these elements. That alone tells us something essential. The gods, including the Anunnaki, required systems to function. Their power was specific, not total. The Anunnaki could judge fate, but they did not control every outcome. They could enforce boundaries, but they did not prevent all transgressions. They could withdraw, but they could not erase the consequences of withdrawal. Their authority operated within a framework that already existed and that continued to exist whether they intervened or not. Daily life for such beings is necessarily procedural. The text suggests that the Anunnaki did not wake to a blank slate of infinite possibility. They entered each cycle with conditions already set. Offerings had either been made or neglected. Rituals had either been performed correctly or allowed to lapse. The world presented itself to them in a state shaped by human action. Their role was to respond, not to constantly override. Response requires limits. If the Anunnaki were omnipotent, response would be irrelevant. They would simply impose outcomes instantly. Instead, they deliberate. They sit. They observe. They wait. These behaviours appear repeatedly in the texts and are often overlooked because they feel too human. But they are deliberate signals. Power in this worldview is not exercised continuously. It is exercised selectively. Selective power preserves order. Daily divine life, therefore, involves long stretches of non-action. This non-action is not inactivity. It is restraint. The Anunnaki maintain readiness rather than constant engagement. They remain capable of judgment without needing to assert it every moment. This restraint also explains why divine decisions feel heavy and final. When a judgment finally occurs, it is not impulsive. It is the culmination of observation. The Anunnaki do not react to single events. They respond to patterns. Daily life, for them, involves monitoring the slow accumulation of imbalance. Monitoring requires perspective. Perspective requires distance. Distance requires limits. The gods cannot be everywhere at once, not because they lack power, but because presence itself alters systems. A god constantly present would distort human behaviour, making autonomy impossible. The Sumerian texts assume that humans act freely within boundaries. Divine oversight is structural, not invasive. This structural oversight shapes divine routine. The Anunnaki do not move constantly through the human world. They are stationary by design. They remain in their domains, receiving information indirectly. Dreams, omens, reports carried by lesser deities, signs in nature. These are the channels through which daily awareness is maintained without direct intrusion. This mediated awareness reinforces limitation. The gods do not see everything directly. They see what the system reveals. This does not make them ignorant. It makes them embedded within order rather than above it. Knowledge arrives through channels that reflect the world's condition. This arrangement mirrors administrative systems familiar to the Sumerians themselves. Kings did not witness every act in their cities. They received reports. Officials brought information. Messengers conveyed outcomes. Authority flowed downward. Information flowed upward. The Anunnaki operate in a similar fashion, scaled to a cosmic level. Their daily life is therefore administrative rather than experiential. They do not plough fields, they do not bake bread, they do not hear every prayer, they preside, they assess. They decide when thresholds have been crossed. This is not omnipotence, it is governance. Governance requires rules. The Anunnaki are bound by precedent. Earlier decisions shape later ones. Fate, once fixed, is not easily altered. This constraint appears repeatedly in the texts. Even gods must respect what has already been decreed. Councils debate. Agreements bind participants. Authority does not mean freedom from obligation. Daily life without omnipotence includes frustration. The texts occasionally hint at divine dissatisfaction. Gods complain. They express weariness. They disagree with one another. These moments are often misread as anthropomorphism, but they serve a deeper purpose. They show that divine life includes tension. Tension arises when power meets limitation. The Anunnaki in particular appear as enforcers of decisions made collectively. They are not always the originators of those decisions. They execute judgments that arise from divine consensus. This role carries weight but also restriction. They must act even when outcomes are severe. Severity is not choice, it is duty. This sense of duty shapes their daily existence. They cannot simply ignore imbalance. They cannot overlook persistent disorder. When patterns reach a certain point, judgment becomes unavoidable. Their role compels action. This compulsion undermines any notion of carefree divine life. The Anunnaki are not depicted enjoying leisure in the human sense. Their rest is not indulgence. It is recovery. Their withdrawal is not pleasure. It is necessity. Their daily rhythm balances readiness with restraint. This balance becomes especially clear in stories involving catastrophe. Floods, plagues, and population reduction are never described as casual acts. They are framed as last resorts. The gods debate. They hesitate. Some oppose the measures. Others insist on them. When action finally occurs, it is because inaction has become impossible. Such moments reveal the cost of divine authority. Daily life without omnipotence means living with consequences that cannot be undone. Once judgment is passed, the gods withdraw. They do not reverse outcomes lightly. This restraint preserves order, but also creates distance between gods and humans. That distance is painful at times. Humans suffer. Cities are destroyed. Lives are lost. The texts do not hide this. They also do not suggest that gods are unaffected. Lamentations exist. Mourning rituals follow disasters. Divine regret appears in subtle ways. Regret implies limitation. A truly omnipotent being would not regret. The presence of regret in the text signals a worldview where power operates within constraints. The Anunnaki live with the outcomes of their decisions just as humans do, though on a different scale. This shared burden reinforces the seriousness of daily divine life. The gods are not playing games. They are maintaining a fragile system. Their daily existence involves vigilance rather than pleasure. Their sustenance, their homes, their rituals all exist to support this vigilance. The lack of omnipotence also explains why the gods value silence. Noise represents uncontrolled activity. Uncontrolled activity generates unpredictability. Unpredictability undermines governance. The gods seek quiet not because they dislike life, but because clarity requires it. Daily divine life therefore values restraint. Restraint in action. Restraint in presence. Restraint in consumption. Even offerings are measured. Excess is destabilizing. Moderation preserves balance. The Anunnaki embody this moderation more strongly than most gods. They are rarely associated with abundance or fertility. Their domain is consequence. Consequence requires clarity. Clarity requires limits. This also shapes how they interact with time. They do not rush. They do not respond immediately. Delay is intentional. Delay allows patterns to emerge. Patterns reveal whether imbalance is temporary or systemic. Only systemic imbalance warrants judgment. This patience is not infinite, but it is significant. Daily life without omnipotence includes waiting. Waiting is one of the least discussed aspects of divine existence, yet it is central to the Sumerian worldview. The gods wait for offerings. They wait for rituals to resume. They wait for humans to correct behavior. Judgment arrives only when waiting fails. The Anunnaki wait more than they act. Their daily existence is therefore quiet, observant, restrained. This quietness is often mistaken for absence. It is not. It is presence held back by design. This design allows the world to function without constant interference. Humans are allowed to act, to fail, to recover. Divine omnipotence would erase that possibility. By operating within limits, the gods preserve human agency while still maintaining cosmic order. The Anunnaki's life reflects this compromise. They are powerful enough to enforce fate, but limited enough to allow it to unfold. They are distant enough to preserve order, but present enough to intervene when necessary. This balance is their defining feature. As time progresses in the narrative, this balance becomes increasingly abstract. Direct divine action gives way to law. Personal judgment gives way to inherited consequence. The Anunnaki's role becomes less visible, but more embedded. Daily life without omnipotence does not fade away. It becomes encoded in institutions, encoded in ritual, encoded in the expectation that the world will respond to neglect even without visible divine presence. The gods do not need to act constantly because their limits have shaped systems that act for them. This is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Anunnaki. They did not rule through endless intervention. They ruled through structure that could persist in their absence. Their daily life, constrained and deliberate, made that possible, and it is within those constraints, rather than beyond them, that their true power is revealed. Aging, renewal, and the limits of the divine body occupy an uncomfortable place in the Sumerian imagination. The texts never state outright that the gods age in the way humans do, yet they also never grant them a condition of perfect, unchanging permanence. Instead, they describe divine existence as extended, resilient, and renewable, but not infinite. The Anunnaki, like the other gods, exist within time. They endure across ages, but they are not frozen outside of change. This tension appears quietly, woven into descriptions of divine behavior rather than proclaimed as doctrine. Gods grow weary. They require rest. They withdraw. They renew themselves through ritual, through offerings, through re-establishment of order. These are not metaphors for boredom or whim. They are indicators of limitation. A being that cannot degrade has no need for renewal. The Sumerian gods do renew. That alone tells us something essential. Their bodies, whatever form those bodies take, are not abstract ideas. They occupy space. They interact with environments. They require conditions that preserve them. The Anunnaki are not described as immortal in the sense of being untouched by time. They are long-lived, but longevity is not the same as timelessness. Longevity implies duration. Duration implies exposure. Exposure implies the possibility of change. Change demands management. This management takes the form of ritual, festivals, offerings, periods of withdrawal. These are not celebrations of abundance alone. They are restorative practices. They recalibrate the divine state just as rituals recalibrate the world. The idea of renewal appears most clearly in moments following disruption. After floods, wars, or divine conflict, rituals resume, temples are cleansed, offerings increase, silence returns. These acts do not merely restore human confidence, they restore divine equilibrium. The gods require this restoration. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and fate, are especially affected by disruption. Their role exposes them to extremes. They preside over death. They enforce irreversible outcomes. This proximity to finality places strain on divine existence. The texts imply that such strain cannot accumulate indefinitely. Withdrawal follows judgment. This withdrawal is not retreat out of guilt or fear, it is recovery. After enforcing fate, the Anunnaki recede to their domains. They disengage. They allow the consequences to unfold without further intervention. This period is as necessary as the judgment itself. Without it, authority would erode. A god who never withdraws becomes exhausted in function, if not in body. The texts hint at this exhaustion indirectly through narratives of divine complaint and disagreement. Gods argue. They resist further action. They seek relief from ongoing strain. These moments reveal that divine endurance has limits. The concept of the divine body is crucial here. The Sumerian gods are not described as formless energies. They sit, they stand, they enter and exit spaces. They eat and drink, they inhabit dwellings. These actions imply bodies that can be affected by environment. A body that exists in space must be maintained. Maintenance implies vulnerability. This vulnerability does not mean fragility. It means dependency on conditions, clean spaces, proper offerings, correct ritual. These are not optional courtesies. They preserve divine capacity. The Anunnaki's bodies, though rarely described in detail, are treated as sites of authority. They are not interchangeable. They do not dissolve and reform freely. When Inanna descends to the underworld and is judged by the Anunnaki, her body is stripped of power piece by piece. This stripping has consequences. She dies. Her body hangs inert. This episode is often interpreted symbolically, but it also demonstrates something concrete. Divine bodies can be diminished. They can lose function. They can require restoration. Inanna's return to life requires intervention, ritual, and substitution. It is not automatic. This is one of the clearest textual indications that divine existence operates within constraints. The Anunnaki enforce this constraint. They do not bend rules even for other gods. Their authority is impersonal. They judge bodies, not intentions. This reinforces the idea that divine embodiment is subject to law. Law exists because bodies exist. A body that cannot fail needs no law. The limits of the divine body also appear in the way gods respond to population growth and noise. Excess human activity is not framed as moral offence alone. It is framed as irritation, disturbance, and strain. The gods cannot rest. They cannot withdraw properly. Their environment becomes unmanageable. This implies sensitivity. A truly omnipotent being would not be disturbed by noise. Disturbance suggests a threshold has been crossed. That threshold exists because divine presence operates within tolerances. The Anunnaki's response to such strain is severe precisely because it addresses systemic overload. When renewal becomes impossible through ordinary means, drastic correction follows. This correction is not renewal itself. It clears the way for renewal. Floods reset the world. Silence returns. Order is re-established. Only then can the gods resume their roles without collapse. Renewal, then, is not optional. It is essential to divine survival. This survival is not about avoiding death. It is about maintaining function. The gods do not fear annihilation. They fear disorder that makes their role meaningless. Aging in this context is not wrinkling or decay. It is accumulation of strain. The text suggests that prolonged imbalance taxes divine capacity. Without ritual maintenance, divine presence weakens. Gods withdraw. Authority diminishes. This is not because gods lose power inherently, but because the system that sustains that power has failed. Humans play a role here. By maintaining ritual, by preparing offerings, by preserving cleanliness, humans contribute to divine renewal. They are not renewing gods out of generosity. They are sustaining the system that allows gods to remain effective. The Anunnaki, who rely on stability more than any other gods, are especially dependent on this maintenance. Their judgments draw upon accumulated authority. That authority is preserved through continuity. Continuity requires renewal. This renewal is cyclical rather than linear. There is no final state of perfect balance. There is ongoing adjustment. The gods endure by moving through cycles of engagement and withdrawal. Their bodies persist by respecting these cycles. The absence of explicit aging narratives does not indicate agelessness. It indicates restraint in storytelling. The Sumerians did not need to describe wrinkles to understand limitation. They described weariness, complaint, retreat, and restoration instead. These are signs of life within time. The Anunnaki's existence stretches across epochs, but it is not static. They witness change. They respond to it. They adjust their presence accordingly. Their endurance depends on this adaptability. This adaptability does not mean flexibility in judgment. Once fate is fixed, it remains. But the conditions under which judgment occurs must be preserved. That preservation is the work of renewal. The divine body, then, is not invincible. It is resilient. Resilience requires care. This care is distributed across the system. Humans provide offerings. Temples provide controlled environments. Ritual provides structure. Withdrawal provides rest. Judgment provides correction. Each element supports the others. Without renewal, divine authority would erode. Without limits, divine power would become destructive. The balance between endurance and constraint defines the god's way of life. The Anunnaki embody this balance most starkly. They do not appear youthful or radiant in the texts. They appear grave, seated, still. Their power is not energetic, it is accumulated. Accumulation requires maintenance. This maintenance is invisible when it works. Only when it fails do limits become visible. Gods complain. They argue. They destroy. These are signs that renewal has been neglected too long. The Sumerian worldview does not imagine an eternal, unchanging divine realm hovering above a disposable world. It imagines a shared system where divine and human fates are linked through maintenance and neglect. The Anunnaki age not in years but in strain. They renew not through transformation but through restoration. Their bodies are not infinite, they are sustained. This understanding strips away the fantasy of effortless divinity and replaces it with something more severe and more coherent. Power that endures does so because it respects limits. As the narrative continues, these limits will shape the final stages of divine withdrawal. Presence will become memory. Sustenance will become symbolic. Judgment will become embedded in law rather than enacted directly. But even then the logic remains. The gods endured because they renewed, and the Anunnaki, bound by the same necessity, lived not beyond limitation, but within it, preserving order precisely because they could not exist without it. There was a time when the distance between gods and humans was narrow enough to feel almost ordinary. Not equal, not casual, but close enough that interaction followed familiar patterns. Food was prepared, offerings were placed, presence was expected. The gods were not abstractions hovering beyond reach. They were participants in a shared system, sustained by human labour and responsive to its condition. This is what is meant by shared tables. Not that gods and humans ate together as equals, but that sustenance moved along a visible path between them. Over time, that path lengthened. The Sumerian texts preserve traces of this transition without ever framing it as a single event. There is no moment when shared tables are declared obsolete, no announcement that intimacy has ended. Instead, the relationship thins gradually. Meals remain, but the sense of immediate presence fades. Offerings continue, but their function shifts. What was once sustenance becomes representation. What was once maintenance becomes memory. This transition reflects a deeper change in how the world functions. In the earliest phases of organized life, divine presence is assumed to be local and responsive. A neglected offering produces visible consequences. A restored ritual brings relief. The connection is direct enough to feel personal, even if hierarchical. The gods are near because the system requires constant oversight. Human institutions are still fragile. Without frequent divine attention, disorder spreads quickly. As those institutions stabilize, constant presence becomes unnecessary. Canals begin to regulate water reliably. Agricultural cycles become predictable. Written law replaces direct judgment. Temples develop professional priesthoods who maintain ritual continuity without requiring divine intervention. The world learns how to carry weight on its own. This changes how the gods relate to it. The Anunnaki, whose authority depends on stability rather than abundance, are among the first to withdraw. Their judgments do not need daily reinforcement once law and precedent take hold. Fate, once encoded into systems, no longer requires constant adjudication. Their presence becomes implicit rather than explicit. Food still moves upward, but differently. Offerings are no longer imagined as meals consumed in proximity. They become acts performed at a distance. Smoke rises, libations soak into the ground. Bread is placed and removed. The gods are acknowledged but not expected to appear. This does not mean belief weakens. It means belief becomes institutional. The shared table requires mutual immediacy. Distant offerings require trust in structure. Humans no longer need to see results instantly. They trust that order will persist if maintenance continues. The gods no longer need to appear frequently. Their authority is already embedded. This embedding is most evident in how offerings are described later in the textual record. Early descriptions emphasize preparation and reception. Later descriptions emphasize correctness and timing. The focus shifts from the gods' needs to human obligation. What matters is not whether the gods are present, but whether humans have done their part. This shift protects the system from volatility. A god who appears too often risks becoming reactive. A god who remains distant allows outcomes to unfold naturally. The Anunnaki's withdrawal into distance preserves the seriousness of their role. Their judgments become rarer, but more decisive. Shared tables invite negotiation. Distant offerings enforce finality. This transition also reflects an increasing separation between sacred and ordinary life. Early on, divine presence is interwoven with daily activity. Later, it is confined to ritual spaces and times. Temples become more isolated. Ritual calendars become more precise. Contact becomes formal. Formality creates distance, but also durability. The Anunnaki benefit from this durability. Their authority no longer depends on constant reinforcement. It exists in expectation. People behave as though judgment will come, even if it does not appear immediately. This anticipation governs behavior more effectively than visible intervention ever could. Food offerings become symbols of alignment rather than nourishment alone. Bread placed before a god does not imply hunger. It implies recognition. Beer poured out does not imply thirst. It implies continuity. The act matters more than the consumption. This symbolic layer does not erase the earlier logic. It builds upon it. The gods were once sustained directly. Now they are sustained indirectly. The system still depends on maintenance, but the maintenance no longer requires proximity. Distance becomes efficient. This efficiency allows divine presence to scale. As cities grow and populations increase, it becomes impossible for gods to remain personally involved in every locale. Distant offerings allow a single divine authority to extend across vast territories. The Anunnaki, as regulators of fate rather than local protectors, fit this expanded role naturally. Their domain shifts from places to principles. Judgment is no longer tied to a specific temple meal. It is tied to law, omen, and consequence. Food remains part of ritual, but its role is now symbolic reinforcement rather than functional sustenance. This does not make offerings empty. It makes them preventative. By continuing ritual, humans signal alignment. Alignment delays judgment. Judgment, when it comes, arrives not as a response to a missed meal, but as a response to systemic failure. The shared table addressed immediate imbalance. The distant offering addresses long-term stability. This distinction explains why divine silence becomes more common in later periods. Silence does not indicate abandonment. It indicates confidence. The gods trust the system to operate without constant supervision. The Anunnaki's silence is especially heavy. When they act, it is unmistakable. Floods, collapses, irreversible decrees. Their distance makes their intervention rare, but absolute. This absoluteness depends on distance. A judge who eats daily with those they judge loses authority. Familiarity breeds negotiation. Distance preserves impartiality. The Anunnaki's withdrawal from shared tables reinforces their role as final arbiters rather than participants. This shift also changes human expectations. People no longer expect immediate divine response to daily offerings. They expect long-term order. When disasters occur, they are interpreted as signs of accumulated imbalance rather than sudden anger. This interpretation reflects a mature system. The world is no longer fragile enough to require constant divine correction. It can sustain long periods of imbalance before collapsing. When collapse happens, it is severe. The Anunnaki appear at these moments. Their appearance is not comforting, it is corrective. The distance between shared tables and distant offerings mirrors the distance between early intimacy and later abstraction. Gods become less visible, but more pervasive. Their presence is felt through outcomes rather than encounters. This evolution reshapes the idea of sustenance. Food no longer sustains gods directly. It sustains the relationship. It keeps memory alive. It reinforces alignment. It prevents erosion of structure. The Anunnaki accept this change because it strengthens their position. They no longer need to rely on constant human attention. Their authority exists independently of daily ritual, even as ritual continues to acknowledge it. This independence allows them to withdraw without disappearing. Withdrawal is not loss, it is consolidation. As offerings become more distant, divine life becomes more insulated. Gods no longer risk contamination from daily disorder. Their environments remain controlled, their judgments remain clear. This insulation is essential as human society grows louder and more complex. Cities become crowded, noise increases, conflicts multiply. Without distance, divine presence would be overwhelmed. Withdrawal preserves function. The Anunnaki's lifestyle adapts accordingly. They no longer require proximity to offerings. They require consistency. They do not require daily acknowledgement. They require alignment. This alignment is maintained through ritual repetition rather than shared experience. Humans perform rituals not to feed hungry gods, but to keep themselves oriented within the system. The act of offering becomes self-regulating. It reminds humans of boundaries even when gods remain silent. This is perhaps the most profound shift of all. The gods no longer need to be present to govern behaviour. Their absence governs it. The shared table created obligation through presence. The distant offering creates obligation through expectation. Expectation is more durable. It persists even when belief wavers, even when rituals become routine. Even when gods feel far away, the structure remains. The Anunnaki's withdrawal into distance ensures that their authority outlasts any particular era of belief. They become principles rather than personalities. This does not erase their identity, it transforms it. The gods still eat, in the sense that offerings continue, but consumption is no longer imagined physically, it is imagined systemically. The gods receive what maintains order. Disorder is what they reject. This abstraction allows their role to survive cultural change. As languages evolve, as myths shift, As cities fall, the logic remains. Maintenance preserves order. Neglect invites correction. The Anunnaki stand at the far end of that logic. They no longer sit at shared tables. They sit beyond reach. This distance is not cold. It is necessary. Without it, judgment would lose weight. Fate would become negotiable. Order would dissolve into constant adjustment. The shift from shared tables to distant offerings marks the maturation of the world. It signals that humans have learned to carry responsibility without constant supervision. It also signals that the gods have learned to withdraw without abandoning their role. This balance defines the later stages of divine life. The Anunnaki are still present, but they are no longer familiar. They are still sustained, but not visibly fed. They still judge, but not frequently. Their distance is the price of stability. As the narrative moves forward, this distance will deepen further. Offerings will become symbolic. Presence will become memory. Authority will become embedded in lore and story rather than encounter. But the logic remains unbroken. The gods once ate near humans because the world required closeness. They now accept offerings from afar because the world can endure it. And in that endurance, the Anunnaki's power becomes quieter, heavier, and more absolute than it ever was at the table. There comes a point in every long-running system when what once required constant attention no longer does, not because it has been abandoned, but because it has been absorbed. In the Sumerian imagination, this moment marks the transition from divine presence as a daily reality to divine presence as memory. The Anunnaki do not vanish at this point. They recede into something quieter, more diffuse, and ultimately more enduring than routine interaction ever allowed. Presence, when it is constant, must be renewed continually. It depends on repetition, reinforcement, and visibility. Memory, by contrast, operates differently. It persists even when not actively recalled. It shapes behaviour without requiring immediate confirmation. When the Anunnaki move from presence into memory, their authority does not weaken. It changes form. In earlier phases, divine presence is expected. Gods are near. They are addressed directly. Their attention is assumed to be available, if not guaranteed. Offerings are made with the sense that they are being received now. Rituals are performed because presence demands acknowledgement. The relationship is active and ongoing. But as systems stabilize, constant presence becomes unnecessary. Canals regulate water without divine adjustment. Laws codify judgments that once required direct intervention. Ritual calendars ensure continuity without improvisation. The world begins to function on inherited structure rather than immediate oversight. In such a world, presence shifts from necessity to redundancy. Redundancy does not erase authority. It preserves it. The Anunnaki, whose role has always been tied to consequence rather than intimacy, are particularly suited to this shift. Their judgments are not meant to be frequent. They are meant to be final. A system that relies on memory rather than routine interaction allows that finality to endure. Memory carries weight differently than presence. A god who appears daily risks becoming familiar. Familiarity invites negotiation. Negotiation undermines inevitability. When divine presence becomes memory, it becomes harder to challenge, harder to bargain with, harder to ignore. This is not an accident of storytelling. It reflects a deep understanding of how authority works over time. The Sumerian texts never describe a moment when the Anunnaki announce their withdrawal. There is no farewell, no declaration of absence. Instead, references to them become less immediate. They are invoked rather than encountered, remembered rather than addressed directly. Their names persist even as their actions recede into the background. This persistence is crucial. Memory does not require visibility. It requires structure. Law remembers judgment. Ritual remembers presence. Myth remembers intervention. These forms of memory ensure that divine authority remains operative even when gods are no longer perceived as active participants in daily life. The Anunnaki become embedded in these structures. Their judgments are remembered as precedents. Their decisions are encoded into expectations. Their authority is invoked when limits are crossed, even if no visible response follows immediately. This delayed consequence reinforces their power rather than diminishing it. When presence becomes memory, accountability shifts. Humans no longer act because they expect immediate divine reaction. They act because they understand that outcomes are inevitable even if delayed. This understanding is more effective than constant surveillance. It internalizes discipline. The Anunnaki's withdrawal into memory thus represents a maturation of the system. Early on, humans require constant correction. Later, they regulate themselves. The gods no longer need to appear because their influence has become structural. The world behaves as though they are watching, even when they are silent. Silence, in this context, is not emptiness. It is saturation. The memory of divine judgment saturates behavior. It shapes choices. It limits excess. It restrains impulse. A god who must appear constantly to maintain order has failed to establish lasting authority. The Anunnaki succeed precisely because they no longer need to appear. This transition also changes how fear operates. Early fear is immediate. A missed offering brings quick consequence. Later fear is abstract. It is the fear of accumulated imbalance. The fear of crossing thresholds whose limits are known but whose timing is uncertain. This uncertainty strengthens authority. If consequences were predictable in timing, they could be gamed. Delayed consequence cannot. It encourages caution rather than calculation. The Anunnaki's judgments become less frequent but more absolute. Memory also reshapes how stories are told. Early myths focus on interaction. Gods speak. Gods argue. Gods act visibly. Later myths focus on origins, laws, and past catastrophes. The gods' actions move into the past, but their relevance does not. It becomes foundational. Foundational stories do not need to be repeated daily. They are assumed. The Anunnaki move into this foundational space. They are no longer characters in ongoing drama. They are principles that underlie it. Fate exists because they fixed it. Judgment exists because they established it. The underworld operates because they govern it. This abstraction allows their authority to persist across cultural change. As languages evolve, as cities rise and fall, the memory of divine order remains adaptable. It can be reinterpreted, re-ritualized, and re-encoded without requiring the gods themselves to return to active presence. Presence is vulnerable to disruption. Memory is resilient. The Anunnaki's shift into memory also protects them from human excess. As populations grow, cities expand, and noise increases, direct divine presence becomes increasingly strained. Withdrawal prevents overload. Memory allows influence without exposure. This insulation preserves clarity. A judge who is constantly confronted loses perspective. A judge remembered rather than encountered remains impartial. The Anunnaki's distance ensures that they are not entangled in daily disputes. They intervene only when the system itself fails. Systemic failure, by definition, accumulates over time. Memory is the medium through which that accumulation is tracked. Humans remember past judgments. They compare present conditions to remembered outcomes. When patterns align, fear returns. Ritual intensifies. Appeals are made. The gods respond not to individual acts but to remembered trajectories. This is why divine punishment in later texts often feels sudden and overwhelming. It is not sudden to the system. It is the result of long-term imbalance. Memory has been warning all along. The Anunnaki's presence, now embedded in memory, does not fade with distance. It becomes more abstract but also more universal. It applies everywhere equally. A local god must be present to act. A remembered authority acts through consequence regardless of location. This universality suits the Anunnaki's role. They are not patrons of specific crops or cities. They are guardians of fate itself. Fate does not need constant supervision. It unfolds according to patterns set long ago. The shift from routine presence to memory also changes how offerings are understood. Offerings are no longer acts of feeding. They are acts of alignment. They remind humans of the system they inhabit. They maintain continuity with the past. They reinforce memory. The gods no longer need the food. Humans need the ritual. This reversal is subtle but profound. Early offerings sustain gods so that gods can sustain the world. Later offerings sustain the world by sustaining memory of divine order. The direction of dependence shifts. The Anunnaki remain at the centre of this memory. They are invoked when finality is required, when disputes reach their limit, when death occurs, when consequences must be accepted. Their absence from daily life makes their presence in these moments unavoidable. No one expects mercy from memory. Memory does not negotiate. This quality makes the Anunnaki more severe as they become less visible. Their judgments feel heavier precisely because they arrive from silence. There is no dialogue, no warning beyond the signs memory has already provided. This severity is not cruelty, it is inevitability. The world has been allowed to run on its own momentum. Intervention occurs only when that momentum becomes destructive. At that point, memory activates judgment. This also explains why later traditions often misinterpret divine distance as abandonment. From a perspective that expects presence, memory feels like loss. But from a systemic perspective, memory is the ultimate form of presence. It shapes behaviour without requiring energy. It governs without exposure. The Anunnaki's evolution into memory represents the success of their original purpose. They were never meant to be companions. They were meant to establish order that could persist beyond them. When presence becomes memory, that goal has been achieved. This achievement does not end divine life. It transforms it. The gods no longer live within routine interaction. They live within structure. Their sustenance is no longer daily food. It is continued alignment. Their homes are no longer visited. They are remembered. This memory is not static. It is refreshed through ritual, myth, and consequence. Each disaster recalls past disasters. Each law recalls past judgments. Each offering recalls earlier exchanges. The Anunnaki remain active within this recall. They do not need to appear because they are already assumed. Their absence is not questioned because their influence is everywhere. This marks the final stage of divine withdrawal. Presence fades, memory remains, routine dissolves, structure endures. The Anunnaki do not disappear from the world, they disappear into it. And once embedded there, their authority no longer depends on belief, attention, or proximity. It depends on the simple fact that systems continue to produce consequences. As long as actions lead to outcomes, their judgment persists. As long as order can fail, their role remains necessary. Presence may have become memory, but memory, once established, is far harder to escape than presence ever was. As the night settles and the noise of the day thins out, what remains is not spectacle, not revelation, not even mystery in the way it is usually imagined. What remains is a pattern, a way of existing that is quieter, heavier, and far more constrained than the idea of gods most people carry with them. Living like them never meant living above everything else. It meant living within a system that could not afford excess, distraction, or constant presence. The Anunnaki were not defined by limitless freedom. They were defined by responsibility that could not be escaped. Their lives were shaped by what had to be preserved, not by what could be enjoyed. They lived surrounded by structure because structure was the only thing standing between continuity and collapse. Food was not pleasure, it was maintenance. Rest was not indulgence, it was recovery. Withdrawal was not abandonment, it was protection. Every aspect of their existence was oriented toward preventing disorder from reaching a point where it could no longer be corrected. This is what is easy to miss when looking back from a modern distance. The Anunnaki were not powerful because they could do anything. They were powerful because they accepted limits and enforced them consistently. They did not seek constant engagement because engagement erodes clarity. They did not seek closeness because closeness compromises judgment. They did not seek visibility because visibility invites negotiation. They lived deliberately far from the noise. Their meals were measured, their spaces were controlled, their days were shaped by rhythm rather than urgency. They acted rarely, but when they did, action carried weight that could not be undone. Living like them meant carrying consequence without relief. It meant knowing that once a decision was made, it would ripple outward long after presence had withdrawn. It meant allowing the world to suffer its own outcomes rather than correcting every imbalance immediately. It meant trusting structure to hold, even when it's strained. This kind of existence is not enviable. It is severe. It is isolating. It is quiet in a way that offers no comfort. The Anunnaki did not live to be admired. They lived to ensure that something endured beyond individual lives, cities, and even eras. Their distance was not cruelty. It was necessity. If they had stayed close, the world would never have learned to stand on its own. If they had intervened constantly, consequence would have lost meaning. If they had remained present, authority would have thinned into familiarity. Instead, they stepped back. They allowed routines to replace encounters. They allowed memory to replace presence. They allowed law, ritual, and consequence to carry what they once carried directly. Living like them meant accepting that being needed does not require being seen. It meant existing in a way that leaves traces rather than footprints, structures rather than stories, outcomes rather than appearances. And this may be the most unsettling part of all, because when divine life is understood this way, it stops feeling distant. It stops feeling mythical. It begins to resemble the invisible forces that shape human existence even now. Systems that persist without faces, rules that operate without voices, consequences that arrive long after decisions are forgotten. The Anunnaki did not rule through presence. They ruled through endurance. They lived in a way that made themselves unnecessary most of the time, and unavoidable when it mattered. That is what living like them really means. Not power without limit, but power that survives by refusing to be everywhere, refusing to be constant, and refusing to be close. A power that waits, and in that waiting continues to shape the world long after the table is empty. The offerings are symbolic, and the presence has become nothing more than a quiet structure beneath everything else. As the night deepens, that idea can rest where it belongs, not as a revelation to act on, not as a mystery to solve, but as a reminder that the most enduring forms of control, order, and influence are often the ones that speak the least, and then fade without ever truly leaving.